I should have waited to say all that, but today it's the mental health module with Linda. Jolene's coming in to do the sexual assault response team. And Rebecca will be doing the impact of sexual violence today. And that's what will be on the record. Okay, Linda, hand it off to you.
Thank you. Here, I'm going to share this and then we'll start from the current slide. What does that look like?
Looks good.
Okay. So before we got on, I did light some medicine and then I played the Eagle song, and we are inviting that sacred energy into the space with us. Some of the stuff we listened to during this whole time together, for some people it is very difficult to hear. Some people are just fine. And for some people it can bring up things that have been a part of their own past, or something they're dealing with currently, or something they've witnessed their loved ones or their family members, friends. So remember, this is not, there are advocates that are available to speak to you if you need. Just put it in the chat to any of the co-hosts or any of the staff, and we'll get some help as soon as we can. So today we're going to talk about mental health first. Let's see. So the goal and objective for this module is just to kind of provide some basic information and a little bit of a distinction between mental health and mental illness, to just help advocates identify if we're going to need a referral or not. Some of the objectives is recognizing the most common signs of depression, suicide, and self-abuse as it relates to survivors of sexual violence, and kind of give you some ideas on when to know when you should probably get a referral. Also identifying the distinctions between mental health professionals and the roles of an advocate. And then identifying the distinctions between chemical dependency counselors and the role of an advocate. So the way that the World Health Organization defines mental health is just simply a state of well-being in which the person realizes their own abilities, copes with normal stresses in life, works productively, and can make contributions to the community. So this is for all of us to think about, and if you're courageous enough to undo your video or just share in the chat, I would really appreciate it. But thinking about the definition of mental health, how does sexual violence impact the health and well-being of the individual that has experienced the violence? How do you think some of the ways it might impact their mental health? Sorry.
They could have the impact could be on maybe their performance at work, how they interact with their family, and just be, not trusting when it comes to the community. So that could be one of the impacts that these individuals who have experienced sexual assault.
That's right. Thank you, Linnell. That's true. That is one of the ways that it can show up, is in work performance. The in the chat is PTSD, anxiety, depression, social isolation, or the loss of feeling of power and control over their life. And then also developing complex PTSD, which is post-traumatic. stress disorder, which can also come along with depression and anxiety. Andrea said the link between productivity and mental health or mental well-being always nettles her, as there is usually missing from the conversation the way explosive. Okay, capitalism and its product. Wait, I'm going up. Products by sexual violence impact the mental health and well-being. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's something we're exploring in our own workspace, in our circle, is the productivity and the things that need to get done because of obligations. And it does not leave room for people to have normal lives or crisis or any type of crime, that it takes up more. It's going to do what it's going to do. So I've met many people that were experiencing anxiety. And when I described the symptoms, as I've seen or witnessed or experienced them myself, people were staring and didn't want to say, because there's such a stigma about mental health and any type of services that we might seek or get. What in the world is going on with this? I'm going backwards and frontwards. Okay, so how do you think it might affect the family? Say the partner or the child of the survivor.
This is Isaac. I just want to say, I think it could impact one's ability to enjoy sexual intercourse with their partner.
Mhm. Yeah. There might be the not wanting to be intimate, or
I don't want to get too far off subject, but I am currently going through something with my daughter, and growing up, she was kind of promiscuous, but now as an adult, she's also fighting with the addiction. But now when somebody does something that's wrong with her, sexual assault, she doesn't see it as being wrong. She kind of accepts it. And then when she tells me about it or something, I try to explain to her, that's not right. Nobody deserves that. And she kind of confuses it with her promiscuity. Like she deserves it or something.
that in some way she has done things in the past that now she has and society feeds that stuff too, all of the media and all of the things. That's why I really do value the mix and the blend of not just mental health services, but there in small communities, there is the stigma of having to go get in line to check in or calling on the phone. And a lot of times there is somebody right from the community answering the phone or working in the clinic. And then the other option is, of course, ceremony and finding trusting people to have ceremony with. Yeah, and as her mother, that is gotta take a toll on you too, to listen and to hear and then to witness the after effects. And so I think it's a trick that many times after a sexual assault, the perpetrator, if not caught, convicted, or brought into public knowledge that this person is hurting people, the victim and their family end up carrying the majority of the load of all of it, including the things that are projected out, including shame and embarrassment and guilt. And really those things should be reversed, and that should be held by the perpetrator and their family instead. And there should be healing for all. But yeah, I think it does affect. Okay, I didn't look into the chat. Yep, children can feel their parents, what their parents are going through. So if they feel the pain, stress, and anxiety from their parent, they'll probably start feeling similar. And thank you, Rebecca. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? The medicine wheel and the spiritual, emotional, body, and mind.
Oh, 1 second. Sorry, my husband was running the vacuum all of a sudden. Sorry, working from home. Sorry about that. But yeah, with whether it's trafficking or sexual violence, domestic violence, even bullying, like all of the intersections, all of the things, when it comes to mental health and our well-being and our healing, I always envision that our health and wellness on any given day is connected to the Changleshka, to the quadrants of our medicine wheels. And I know tribes have, some medicine wheels have like 6 colors and sections. So, you know, I say that with an open mind of what that means individually. You okay? Okay, baby, go. This spiritual, emotional, body, and mind, all of those pieces can be affected by the children and the family and the community, significant others that are involved. And then, so that balance gets disrupted. And then we're not in a healing place. Sometimes that healing journey starts with just the body, going to a sane nurse, going to the hospital, going to the clinic and taking care of the body. And then taking care of our minds and processing and talking and not being in a world of silence. Then the spiritual aspect of healing all of the trauma, especially, you know, I don't know if the module's been done yet or if it's coming, but abuse by faith leaders, that can add a whole nother level to it. And then the thing that isn't talked about a lot with sexual violence, but it's so present, is that judgment and the shame and the silence. And when confidentiality is broken and there's victim blaming, and that gossip just kind of corrodes that wellness of that medicine wheel approach. So all of that comes into play. I don't know if that makes sense, but thank you, Linda, for letting me speak.
Thank you for speaking. So Alania is talking about secondary trauma experienced by family members. Sexual assault survivors' mental health can significantly decline, taking them away from the connectedness between family members and familial roles. And then finally, when you think about it, mental health as it relates to sexual assault victims, and thinking about mental health, and we know the individual, and we talked a little bit about the family, but what about community? Can the whole community be affected by what has happened? Say when there's been a sexual assault accusation at the school, or maybe something is talked about in community and people know because it is a small community. What are some ways that might show up in our entire community? I think what Rebecca was talking about with the gossip and with people saying things. I was listening at a powwow. I was sitting by the car because my kids were dancing, and it was the junior categories at that time in my life. And I was listening to other women that were moms of the other kids that were dancing, and they were discussing, I think, like a 14-year-old girl and some of the things that had happened. And they said she didn't come back last night. And then I was just sitting there listening because we're waiting for our kids to come back. And another woman said, yeah, she's always been trouble. She's always got all kinds of problems. And she's just an embarrassment to her family, to her dad and to her grandma and all the stuff she does. And I was looking at them, and then I said, well, wait, how old is she? And they said 14. And I said, so she's what, running away from home? Is that what you said? And they said, yeah, she's always in trouble and running away. But I said, I would be more concerned about why is she running away? And these are women from the community that are moms in the community the girl is living in. And I said, the emphasis should be on why is she running, not attacking or questioning her or putting a judgment on her. I would think that you would be concerned about why is she running away? Because most of the time kids don't run away from places that are really healthy. Or maybe there's something that happened. And everybody got really quiet and then they didn't speak to me for years and years, none of them. But I mean, just having, a redirection, but entire communities can have misinformation about sexual violence and the responses that we are giving. So, the best we can do as programming and citizens of our communities and moms and aunties and uncles and relatives is to put out right information, about where does the responsibility lie. And when it comes to mental health, there's such stigma. So yeah, entire communities can be affected by misinformation. Yeah. So some of the common reactions to sexual assault. Some have immediate reactions and some react much later. Also, there's varying levels of fear, anger, self-blame, depression, anxiety. Some people's sleep is affected. They can have difficulty concentrating. There can be flashbacks and then an emotional numbing. It's almost as though the body has and the brain has a way of protecting the person, and there can be a numbing that comes over them. And to talk about these things when somebody has had sexual violence in their life is kind of a good thing. So they're not by themselves, or if you have printed material to talk about, because sometimes when a flashback is coming on, that can really cause some, any of these can cause major problems for people. But having those things happen and not any idea what it is when it's happening is really frightening. And remember this, that some of the reactions depend on previous life experiences, also the type and the amount of force that was used, and the age of the victim, and then the responses from family, from community, and from systems. I don't know, but I've been an advocate for a while, and I have had people tell me that when they told what happened, that people got mad at them. And that can be right in their own family. And it has to do with all of the things we talked about, including shame and embarrassment, or maybe it is helping somebody to remember something that happened to them. And so they don't want to talk about it. But I've had people be hit for telling. Also, that's right from family too. And then out in the community, I've had entire groups of people in the community saying things to the survivor in public to humiliate and degrade them. And then systems, it can be if we have people who are not knowledgeable about sexual violence, the response can be the same as some misinformed family or misinformed community. The system can have the same response. Say you have a clerk of court or a judge who doesn't have a lot of information or education about sexual violence and the after effects. Also, if the perpetrator is known to the person, that can have a different reaction. And if the perpetrator is unknown, that can produce a whole different set of stress for them. So when we think about what is mental illness, it is a medical condition. It disrupts the person's daily functioning, their thinking, their feeling, their mood, and their ability to relate to others. Also results and can result in a diminished capacity for coping with ordinary demands of life. So the statistics are 1 in 4 adults suffer from a diagnosable mental disorder. So if you can say it out loud, just what are some of the words you have heard used to describe people with mental illness? And think about from the time you were a child all the way up until today. What are some words you've heard people in community and family or friends saying when they knew or they heard somebody was having or dealing with mental illness?
Loony.
Yep. Did you hear that? She said loony.
Just looking for attention.
Yep. Somebody just looking for attention. Dramatic.
Acting weird.
Yep. Mariana said that some people with mental illness somehow appear untrustworthy, or that people are more leery that they would lie. Nutty is another word. Yeah. So what were you taught about mental illness when you were growing up? When you think about it, what were some of the things that your family said? Was there anybody that you knew or somebody that you saw or somebody in community? Isaac is saying that what the teaching was mental illness equals weakness. And I think for a lot of us, that is what it is. You're not supposed to cry. You're not supposed to have any emotions. You're not supposed to stay away from them. They might hurt you, is another thing being said. That's Kathy. When somebody's mentally ill, you should avoid them. Are there shame in mental illness? Very good. Thank you for sharing. And then there's families like Jen is saying that they never talked about it, even though there was mental illness in the family, that people just didn't talk about it. That is exactly what happened to me. I didn't know what was wrong, but I had a couple of my aunts, and a long time ago, they used to call it breakdowns. And I would be sitting there like, what does a breakdown mean? What does that mean? But they knew somebody had to go to the hospital. And I was like, when you break down, what happens to you? And they were trying to explain it to me. And it wasn't from a sympathetic or understanding or compassionate way. And then I was witness to suicide attempts and with adults. And I did not understand what was happening, except that the cops came. And so you're watching that. And I think for children and for other people, it's very confusing. And nobody had, the compassion part is missing. And I think everything you're saying is right along the lines of what I've experienced. Does anybody have anything else to share?
I actually had, I guess, my first breakdown when I was about 13 years old. And I blew up on one of my favorite teachers. And I was, I was the teacher's pet. I was a straight A student, and she didn't understand why I was having a breakdown on her. And it was, because my life was chaos. My parents were alcoholics. They were constantly putting each other in the hospital. There were drug addicts in and out of our house. I had machine guns held to my head. They were in and out of jail. And I'd had enough, but I'd never really heard about mental illness. We never really talked about any of it. It was just what I understood my life to be. And so when I had that mental breakdown in, I think I was like the 8th grade, maybe, my teacher ended up taking me to the principal's office, and I ended up just crying and telling them everything I was dealing with. And they set it up to where I was going to see the school counselor. And I remember going home and I was going to tell my mom, and I was so scared she was going to be mad at me for telling everything that was going on in our life, and mad at me for breaking, I guess, because she was a very strong woman, and, she really always just handled things. She never sought help or anything like that. And she just told me, I'm glad. She said, I'm glad that you're talking to somebody. And I remember thinking, oh, so this is allowed, And so I seen the school counselor for a while, but I still didn't really understand the mental health aspect of it. I was like, okay, I'm talking to somebody, until like I was 15. And then that's whenever I started having psychology classes. And I was just like, oh my God, this all makes so much sense. But it was not really something that was talked about in my community or my family prior to that. And I've always found that to be very interesting. It's probably a generational thing, or I don't know what.
Thank you so much for sharing. And then when you think about this, how do we view mental illness in our Native communities and in our families? Just exactly some of the things she was talking about. That there's a lot of shame and embarrassment. And then there's people that want you to get help and want you to be well. It's just a combination, but I think there's a lot of misinformation. And when you think back to somebody and some of the things that are happening, including violence, that some of those are experiences because of what we are living with or living through, or what we have experienced in our past. And some is imbalance of hormones and other chemicals that react in our brain, and things are treatable. But when we need help or people need help, it's best to find somebody that is at all compassionate about mental health and stability. And then to be the resource for the community to know that it's okay to need help. Yes, there is a lot of shame that comes in. And I was talking to the clinic about the way it was set up, because we'd have to go through the main clinic. And then when you get to the front desk, there was two people sitting there in the Indian Health Service, would get there, and then they ask where you're going, to dental, medical, or mental health. And you have to tell who you are at that place, and other people can hear you. And then they could hear you, and who knows, if that's your cousin's, or if that's your neighbor's mom or something like that. Is just this big stigma. And so the mental health actually moved their facility outside of the medical clinic, still in the property, but there was, there was more privacy, and we need to let people have their privacy until they feel well enough to share, if ever, how they're getting and working on their stability. So a lot of us have seen this, maybe in our own community, or we've experienced it, but there is some indicators of how depression might look as a result of sexual assault. The person can experience difficulty concentrating, remembering details, making decisions. A lot of times when you're talking to somebody, just I think being in trauma and having the after effects, when I'm asking somebody a story and I'm trying to help them with their statement, and just they might remember in chunks or details or something. For some people, it was hard to put things in a chronological order, because they're still experiencing in these bursts of how I'm remembering things. Also, there can be fatigue or decreased energy, people that are can't seem to get out of bed, or can't seem to muster up the energy to make the phone calls that they need to, or to do even tasks, or sometimes to eat. They won't even eat. Also, there can be feelings of guilt, worthlessness, hopelessness, persistent anxiety. Remember, I was telling you that when I talked to people about what anxiety was and some of the symptoms that it can happen, most of the people I talked to were saying that they had experienced that. they didn't know it had a name. Also, there can be fear and an empty, kind of a sick feeling. Or there, on the opposite, there can be insomnia, people who cannot sleep. Either excessive sleeping, early morning wakefulness, or night terrors. It can show up. Not any one of these is exactly, but these are just a list that when somebody's talking to you or when you're visiting, that these are some of the things you want to talk about. So it's in their radar, and that family that's supportive might be aware of. Also, there can be an irritability or restlessness, almost like an anger too. I've seen people get really enraged. Loss of interest in activities that were once pleasurable. And this is what Isaac was talking about, including sex, overeating or appetite loss, persistent aches, pains, headaches, cramps, digestive system problems, including, I suppose you can get, some people get instant release of the contents of their stomach, either by vomiting or diarrhea is another thing. When they hear troubling news or something has happened, it can manifest in their digestive system. Very common. Headaches, migraines, that type of stuff. And then finally, thoughts of suicide and suicide attempts. And then there are signs of clinical depression. And remembering, none of us are counselors or therapists. Most advocates are not, but we see a lot of people, and lots of us have experienced a lot of stuff. So, or we've witnessed. But clinical depression has its own definition. It's also known as major depression or major depressive disorder. It is not the same as depression caused by loss or death of a loved one. Then there's a mood disorder, feelings of sadness, loss, anger, frustration that can interfere with just functioning every day. And that can last for weeks. And then there is no single cause, and often it involves interaction with many diverse biological, psychological, and social factors. I've seen people who've had stuff happen and they have not one supportive person in their life, not one. So where they live, there is criticism and anger or ignoring them. Let's see, what's
Okay, I'll come to outside. Bye.
also what can come up is that a perpetrator can be suffering in their mental health and past trauma as well. And if they aren't ready to seek help, they can use mental health as an excuse for the harm they are putting on others. So it needs to be easier for everybody to seek help. Mhm. Oops. Yeah, that was right. Okay, post-traumatic stress disorder. There's like over 3 million cases in the US every year. PTSD is a response to experiencing trauma. It can include re-experiencing the traumatic event, which includes flashbacks, nightmares, intrusive imagery. And it can include avoidance of possible triggers, staying away from places, events, objects that are reminders of the event, feeling emotionally numb, guilt, depression, losing interest in activities. Other signs might include being easily startled. Did you ever see the startle reflex? Feeling constantly on edge, like something bad is going to happen. And then there can be, again, difficulty sleeping, angry outbursts, and many other. I've seen people pacing in the middle of the night. Also, different things can make people remember. Sometimes it sounds, fireworks, different smells, different songs. You know, there was something in the background because as trauma is taking place, all of your senses are aware that trauma, something's wrong. So your smell, your hearing, your visual, and your feeling, everything is affected on the person. So when those things are remembered, it could help us to feel this manifesting again, or we might witness somebody having this happen. And then suicide facts. In a lot of our tribal communities, we have high rates of suicide ideation and completion. And there was a time when there would be more than a couple in a little space and time. But we know that in the United States, that suicide takes about 30,000 people per year. And it is the second leading cause of death for American Indian Alaska Native youth from the ages of 15 to 24. Many who attempt suicide never sought professional care or weren't brought to professional care. Also, substance abuse is a risk factor for suicide. And there is a high correlation between suicide attempts, suicide ideation, and sexual assault victimization. There was a time in our community where the suicide attempts were people who never received any type of validation or support or services for sexual violence. There was limited support and services in our community. And so when that was identified, the people that were working with youth brought that to our tribal leadership to talk about it and to get help with what was happening. And the strongest risk factor for suicide is depression that is not treated. Some of the symptoms and signs for a suicide ideation as related to a sexual assault victimization is they might think or talk about suicide. There might be a history or somebody who is now using substances. They can have no sense of purpose or no sense of belonging anywhere. There can be anger, rage, or flat affect. Hey, Christine, what is flat affect? Or does anybody know what is flat affect? I have no feelings whatsoever. Is that what that means?
Yeah, and it doesn't show on your face, you know.
Okay.
We're all, you know, we're well skilled at looking at people's facial expressions and all those things. And sometimes we don't show any emotion. That's just a flat affect. Yeah. Even though we may be internally on fire with fear or rage or guilt or shame or all the feelings we feel, some people are very skilled at not showing it on their face.
They can also feel trapped, like there's no way out from what's happening in their life. And they can totally withdraw from community, from family, from friendships. Also anxiety. No, that's not just all of these things have to be present or any of that, but it's just clues for you to look at. Also anxiety, that irritability and being agitated or kind of edgy. Some people are shaking their legs. Some people, you know, there can be recklessness, risk-taking behavior where there's no, not a value on if I die or not. And then some are just dramatic changes in moods. When to make a referral: when somebody is suicidal or homicidal and they're talking to you about it. That is a lot for an advocate to try to handle. And I never want to be the last person somebody was talking to when they took their life. And I did not try to get them some kind of support. So we need to try to remember that it's not your big load to carry. And as an advocate, you can only do the best you could do. So what you would do was you have your list of referrals. So you want to make a referral when somebody's telling you, I'm going to go kill him or kill her, you know, or when they're talking about taking their own life. Also, if you notice people aren't eating or for days, or their sleep patterns are really different, the withdrawal from everybody, or if somebody starts giving away the things that they value, including, you know, anything personal, sometimes prayer tools, drums, regalia, different things that, you know, what are you doing? You really like that, you know, you do that. Or mood changes, sad to happy. And then, of course, if somebody requests one. And I guess I would talk about it a little bit with them too, that you want them to get the help they deserve. And sometimes even with the referral, it's not a match for them. Like the person, you know, not all therapists are everybody's, you know, that's it, that's great. Sometimes we have to have a couple, but you know, advocates will know what's available for in our community. We might only have a couple here in our community, a lot of them master of social work. And then we might have a neighboring border town or a bigger facility off the res or out of our community that has a variety of people. And some therapists have specialty services where this is what they work with, is sexual assault survivors. And sometimes they have some that work with youth. So I would, as an advocate, find out where the help is in our community and what type of services they offer and how do I do the referrals, getting the information. Is there anything you want to add to that? So self-harm and self-mutilation. The definition is deliberate, secret infliction of physical harm. Survivors might use self-harm to cope with sexual assault. It provides temporary relief for them. It can cause permanent damage to the body, and it is associated with guilt, self-loathing, and isolation. Some of the more common signs that you could see is somebody who's cutting, burning, biting, or hitting their body, pulling out hair, where they're pulling strands of hair, but they could have patches that are missing. Also, scratching and picking at sores on their skin. And then finally, eating disorders, anorexia, that's almost like starving. And then on the other end is somebody who is binge eating. And then substance abuse. So these are ways that people can harm themselves.
Yeah, I just have to share this. I was at the swimming pool with my kids probably about a month ago, and I seen a little girl. She was 13 or 14, real pretty. But she had from her wrist all the way up to the middle of her arm, scars, you know, from cutting, on her shoulder, the back of her leg, and on her upper thigh. And I thought, you know, what a good time for me not to have my cards with me, but I wrote her a little note, you know, and I just told her if she ever needed help or, you know, wanted to talk to somebody, and I gave her my phone number. But I didn't know any other way to approach her because, you know, she was with her friends, of course. But she just had all the screaming out for help signs, you know. So it was like it was just a sad thing to see. And she was 13 or 14.
Thank you for doing that and for reaching out to her. And a lot of people who survive trauma and are struggling attribute even one person as helping them through all of it. So whatever we're doing, you know, it is the best we could do at the time. And some people will sit on the fence and not do it, and then the opportunity passes, and hopefully it'll be presented again with somebody else. Beverly is talking about something that concerns her is currently getting an appointment can be months out or having to wait a while to see somebody. It's so common today, and it's true because of the pandemic and the limited resources that we have. Um, this also could be helpful with having like a support group or a one-on-one support, that there's so many things that can get shared and talked about in a way that is non-judgmental and that the person feels supported. We could never be successful with support groups because our community was so small and people didn't want other people listening to them. So we did better with the one-on-one support or just a couple of people or sometimes the family. And then we'd pick a topic and then talk about that topic this afternoon or tonight, or we'd have arrange so that they could have somebody to talk to, because a lot of times people really need somebody to listen, and then there's times they need more than just the listening and the coping skills. And that is where we'd make a referral. And it is sad if somebody is having to wait months. Can you imagine that? It's like you have to wait and wait and wait to even talk or be with somebody about what has happened or what you're experiencing. Yeah. And if you see that, what I'm thinking of from a problem solving, if that's happening in our community, I would want to address it with the leadership on how we could do that, because there are other ways to access services. And sometimes it's through the use of the internet and Zoom or a phone. I've seen my grandson do counseling on the phone where he could see the person and he was alone in his room talking. So, there's other ways, and if we could reach out, then it makes the opportunity to get help, it increases for our people. Christine has put into the chat, mental health crisis lifeline started back in July on the 16th. And there's even texting options. So these would be excellent resources to have in your office, that you would be able to share this either by brochure, a little handout, or a card that somebody could have to look at and to see, oh, okay, so I can text these people. Yeah, she's got a lot of information there in the chat. Thank you, Christine, for getting that. But if you are concerned about somebody who is suicidal, don't be afraid to ask them about it directly. And if somebody says they're thinking about killing themselves, validate what they've shared with you. You can ask, do you have a plan? And then, do they have the means to kill themselves? Remembering that self-harm and suicide are different. Someone can self-harm without any intentions of killing themselves, and vice versa. You want to call law enforcement or 911 for an emergency. And here is another option: text NATIVE to this number for culturally competent crisis counselors. There is the National Suicide Prevention Line, and then the Strong Hearts Native Helpline. All of those are excellent resources. So some of the role clarification for us today: the role of an advocate is to be well informed about suicide and warning signs. Remembering, report if the victim has attempted suicide or is threatening or expresses homicidal ideation. Also making proper referrals. The role of the mental health professional is to assess and case management. They can ask very direct questions about suicidal ideation. They should be listening and to be non-judgmental, and make a referral to a psychiatrist if it's needed. Okay, she's got those further. So for chemical dependency, the definition is a disease characterized by the addiction to a mood-altering chemical. That includes both drugs and alcohol. Many signs, both physical and behavioral, indicating drug use. Each drug has its own symptoms or side effects. Some of the common signs are drinking alone in secret, hiding drugs or alcohol, a preoccupation with alcohol, physical need and withdrawal, an inability to function appropriately at home or work, some legal troubles, getting a DUI. And then there can be sudden changes in their behavior, or there can be mood swings and changed sleeping patterns. So to clarify the role of advocates and a chemical dependency counselor is, for us, it's going to be to focus on the safety and what the victim or survivor wants or needs. Also referring the survivor if it's what they want, building relationships with the local treatment facilities to educate about the dynamics of sexual assault to support victims. I also would go in and do in-service where I would provide for the people who were in treatment, both day treatment and where they were residents, and talk about sexual violence and some of the things, just an overview. And every time I went, we got referrals for people who were disclosing sexual violence in their life. So I would encourage you to build relationships with the local program. Also, the role of the chemical dependency counselor is they will do an assessment. They determine what type of treatment is needed based on the answers in the assessment and their intuitive conversations with the person. Also developing any type of goals or treatment plans, and they would make referrals if necessary for any type of medical emergencies. So this is the role clarification between us and mental health professionals. Is we as advocates might listen to conversations and have conversations that we can recognize the thoughts, feelings, behaviors as they relate to the sexual assault. Also providing education about the dynamics of sexual assault to the systems, to the victims, and to any supportive family and friends. We want to expand supportive networking and help create positive experiences and memories. But the role for the mental health professional will be case management, any types of assessments, also developing goals or treatment plans. They'll do a diagnosis for mental illness, determine any services that might be needed, and then focus on the needs of the individuals. So the role, our role is to make sure that we're explaining our role. We are not there to pass judgment. We really should maintain confidentiality at all times. We're not experienced enough to do any type of diagnosis, although I've heard that is really happening in some programs. But we can make referrals. We explain the risks and the benefits of decisions, also providing individual and group support and education, and asking, of course, the survivor what they need or what they want, and then try to help them with getting what they need or what they want. The role of the mental health professional is to provide individual, couples, family, or group with therapy. Also making referrals to psychiatrists if it's necessary to determine if medication is going to be needed. Okay. So remembering, we want to make a referral when the victim or the survivor requests services from a mental health professional. Also, when we see warning signs that include scars, wounds from self-mutilation or cutting, when there's suicidal ideation, when there's homicidal ideation, or when there's a description of harm to self and others. We want to make the referral at that time. So when making referrals, if they choose, survivors can be referred to the following local professionals or spiritual guides. Mental health professionals, here's what a list may look like in your community. Holistic professionals, and then medical professionals. And then there is the traditional healers and spiritual guides. So some of the implications for change. In the system change, we want to build relationships with mental health professionals because it's going to increase the understandings about the dynamics of sexual assault as a social problem, not an individual problem. And for social change, we want ongoing public awareness and public education so we can break the stigma of those impacted by sexual assault and then developing or having mental health issues. So thank you for that. That is the mental health module. Was that scheduled for 1 hour? Let me look here. Yes, it wasn't. Dang, we're right on time.
Yeah, wow, you're good.
Awesome.
Thank you so much. Does anybody have any questions? Does anybody? Well, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for all the amazing stuff happening in the chat and for those who commented and for saying your name before you speak. I know that's a little weird, but it really helps our interpreters know who's talking. So we're trying to get better. We're trying to get better as we go. It's a learning curve for all of us. So, oh, Linda's just kidding. She's coming back. Okay, well, that was the mental health module. Let's take a break and we'll see you at like 15 minutes. So 18 minutes after the hour, come on back and then Jolene will be joining us for the sexual assault response team module. Okay. All right, we'll see you in 15 minutes. I'm gonna pause the video here. Okay. Peace. Take care, and I'll see you on Thursday. Miss Jolene, take it away.
Just leaving me, Christine. All right. Well, I'll do a little intro for myself, but as Christine mentioned with the poll not working, please chat in your familiarity with SARTs or multidisciplinary teams. Do you have one in your community? Was there one in the past? Do you know that one exists, but you're not on it? Just please feel free to chat that in. But yeah, so Bonjour, my name is Jolene Engelking, and I am one of the staff here at MIWSAC. I've been with MIWSAC now for about 2 years, which seems like, I love you, I did, sorry, my child is leaving the house. I've been with MIWSAC for about 2 years, and prior to that, I got my start, as a lot of people do, in that community-based advocacy. I was at a small program in a very rural area where I sat on 4 different SARTs, as well as one of the tribal SARTs in our community. And so I kind of had a deep appreciation for them from that very, very beginning. Then throughout my career, I've been doing this national training and technical assistance for about 7 or 8 years at this point, with a big chunk of that being focusing on rural SARTs and helping teams develop, sustain, rethink the way that we are doing this sort of work together. I am White Earth Anishinaabe from here in Minnesota. And yeah, my primary role here at MIWSAC is part of our National Training and Technical Assistance team. My role is really focused on our Project Beacon, which is for urban Indian communities as they're developing and sustaining their sex trafficking or human trafficking services. All right, so we have a few people in the chat. Somebody wrote the SART MOU for their county and as well as developed a county CCR, mildly familiar as an advocate, SART coordinator in the area, not familiar with MDTs, very familiar, currently on call for SARP. Agency has an MDT meetings routinely, and then these are brand new. Yeah, it's always just kind of good to know, and as we'll talk, there's going to be like a lot of space for this to be able to be made your own. As we're talking about this, we are really wanting to figure out what is that best space for this to be for, like, you know, these 40-hour trainings, as they were originally intended, were for, you know, people brand new to this field. And so when we're doing this PowerPoint, I'm trying to keep that kind of in line, even though I know that so many of you have many years of experience, both directly with this and related. So this is what we're doing today. What advocates need to know about sexual assault response teams? We're going to talk about a bunch of different stuff today, but at the heart of it, at the end of the day, I would like everybody to be leaving with a little bit of a solid understanding about what a SART is, what a SART can do, and really some good mullings about what you can do in your own community to strengthen or just have a better collaborative response within your own community. All right, and so as we're getting y'all into this afternoon time, I want to do a little bit more of the chatting in. And so thinking about, you know, after a sexual assault, so we're thinking crisis advocacy, you know, at this point, what external supports do survivors need? Immediately, and sometimes those we know pretty well, in the months, weeks after, and in the long term. So we'll be chatting things in here in a minute, but when we're thinking about who people need if they're choosing to seek help after an assault, it is so important for all of those systems responders who are involved, so to know that they're informed, that people actually know about sexual assault, that you're not just, you know, talking to somebody who has no idea what sexual assault is, what are the nuances, what do Indigenous survivors of sexual assault need, as well as somebody who knows the other parts of the system and how it's supposed to work. We need people who are connected, who have those relationships either on that individual level or on the systemic level, and who work in partnership as appropriate. So this is the definition that I've been sort of liking, is the circle of people, each bringing their own knowledge and experience, a web of support for survivors, making safer communities, and holding harm doers responsible. I like that it's that circle of people each coming together. It's also, you know, in a much more direct way, it's a multidisciplinary team. So people from different disciplines coming together, focusing on improving the collaborative response to sexual assault. with these, they're really vehicles for building relationships, for co-learning, because the best way to learn is really to be having people talk about their own experiences and their understanding from that, as well as learning new topics and new things together as a community to improve protocols, and better support survivors. At the end of the day, survivors are at the center and the core of all that a SART should be doing. And so this is just my little spiel. I have worked with dozens, approaching hundreds of SARTs across the country and into Canada. And one of the things that I've found is that when we're talking about what a sexual assault response team is, there are so many different names. And even in the chat, I was noticing a few different names that people are calling things. When you're talking about an MDT, often that's a multidisciplinary team. Often we hear about them being focused on acute cases. So, like right after a sexual assault happens, it's a group of people who, come together right around that response, or there's people who do some, case management in the coming weeks as the case processes. And sometimes we found that those MDTs are focusing on minors or child sexual assault. We also hear these sexual assault response teams called protocol development teams. When these SARTs started getting really big across the country, 20, 30 years ago, a major focus, and still to this day, it is really sometimes at the core of what SARTs do. But a lot of the whole process was built around protocol development. So it was developing a protocol, implementing a protocol, making revisions, and sometimes just starting all fresh again. And so some people still keep that name of protocol development teams. And then a lot of other things, SARC, SMART from the year in Minnesota, SART, which was what I was on, which was a sexual assault reservation response team, and many other things that are out there based on, community needs. And sometimes that can be driven by funding. I've also seen STOP teams, so many other teams. And depending on the community, they may be combined with the response to domestic violence or human or sex trafficking. And so as I kind of alluded to, when we're talking about things, SARTs can be broken down broadly into two categories. There's the systems focused, which are those big picture collaborations where you're working with organization to organization and system to system to really figure out how are you improving the response for everyone in your community. And you're dealing with things like those policies, protocols. Acute focus is often on that case-by-case basis. And I will say that, when I started here at MIWSAC, it was really fun for me because I love advocacy training. It is one of my favorite things ever. And I specifically love this 40-hour advocacy training. I'm part of, I think, one of the first tests, the pilots of it, when there was like 15 of us in a room and we were trying it out. But one thing that I've been really excited about is really helping MIWSAC and all the communities that we work with rethinking how we're talking about SARTs and how we're thinking about that response. And that's also rough, naming that we live in a day and age where it can be really hard for people to want to go to even the hospital, let alone talking to law enforcement, prosecution, with all the inequities and harm that people have experienced from the systems. And so we're talking about improving a system right now that many feel should be dismantled. And so in this conversation, we're walking in a few different worlds where, particularly for many advocates across the country, they've had to develop a strong relationship with law enforcement and other systems, while simultaneously often working towards creating like long-lasting systemic change. Talking about that systems focused, so those macro level SARTs, if you want to call it that, but just naming that, not all SARTs are going to be able to meet the needs of all survivors. And so I know that in prior sessions, folks have talked about the medical response, the prosecution response, law enforcement response, and they're also key and integral. And sometimes as a community, especially within our tribal communities, we need to be rethinking what we're doing as SARTs, and the way that we're talking about them were created by and for mainstream communities. All right, so who should be on a SART? And so the traditional SART structure, and I call it that as that is what was most early funding streams, or even most communities who began to develop on their own a collaborative response, who was part of that. And the core four that I call them are advocacy. I feel that having systems advocacy and community-based advocacy are both so important to be on a team like this. Law enforcement, prosecution, medical, typically, like a medical forensic examiner, such as a SANE, or whatever is able to be sustained within your community. And those are the four disciplines that typically make up SART. More growing across the country has been trying to explore the role of having corrections and or probation on the team, as they are also an integral part. Often they've been kind of left out because of the fact that a lot of cases don't move forward. There's a lot of times where people aren't prosecuted. And so the role of corrections and probation is kind of nebulous. But they really can be an essential component, both to the team as well as if they know more about the earlier stages. It's been found to be pretty beneficial for communities. What I've been really trying to explore, and a lot of SARTs, including other national TA providers, have been promoting and trying to develop more resources and experimenting around, is how can we increase the community role within a SART? And that can be both, actually having community members on a SART, or it's just simply expanding beyond those traditional 4 or 5 members to really be thinking about who all needs to be at the table and who within your unique and beautiful community should be there, because they are important to the response in whatever way that is for survivors. I really think that, key points of disclosure. So who are those people that a survivor goes to tell about a sexual assault? So whoever those key points of disclosure are should maybe be at the table, maybe not all the time, but they should be a part of it at the same point. Or different accesses to healing or justice. So both who people go to talk about things and who they go to when they're really wanting that support, as they're working towards healing. And so some of those can be, depending on your community, the schools, different community representatives. That is something that is very scary for some SARTs to explore, is having, community members who aren't part of the system within space, as well as kind of very linked to that is, should survivors be able to be on a SART? That's a whole conversation that people get very, very heated about. Mental health. There's some teams where I've seen have, 5 mental health practitioners at the table, which can be a very important route for people to be considering. And these last 2 are at the bottom, but when it comes down to it, they are probably, especially for our Indigenous communities, for our tribal SARTs, and even for SARTs who are maybe in urban, suburban, or rural areas, to really be thinking about how they can better include are our traditional healers and culturally specific programs. And so I would love for folks to kind of chat in, who else do you think should be on a SART? Ooh, somebody already started before I even got that out. Yes, so local churches. In some communities, local churches are some of those, both either those key points of disclosure or those accesses to healing or justice. And I think that those can be an important part of your SART if that is what is going to be useful within your community. Sometimes people such in churches or other nonprofits may also hold some positional power based on their relationships with other people in the community. And so it can be really good to have in that space. But who else, either within your community, have you seen, or do you think would be really important to have on your SART? So please chat in some ideas. I'm going to take a sip of coffee right now. School counselors, yes. Especially if your SART is, working with minors. And so depending on funding streams and frameworks, some SARTs, they may only deal with people who are older than 18 or older than 12, 13, 16, whatever age it may be. But if you are working with anybody who is a minor, the school counselors are an integral role, as well as leading off of that, universities. And who from a university could or should be on within that space, right? Prosecution, but as child advocacy centers, yes. With reservations, there can be several schools around with who they want to coordinate with. Yeah, and when we're talking, going off of that, there's sometimes where you may not need all of these people, in a space every single month to be talking about things or to be working on stuff. But there may be times where you want like a school subcommittee or something like that, where people are able to come together to add influence and advise the smaller group at different points. So, but yeah, I mean, I've seen people try things even like with dispatch. So dispatch may not need to be on every single SART meeting that you have, but there's times where, even once or twice a year to bring somebody in, because dispatch for some is that initial point of disclosure. And it's really both useful for the people who work in dispatch as well as the people on the team to kind of know both sides, because that is a very important part of the system. Even things such as I was going to say such as the BCA here in Minnesota, where it's a crime lab where they do the testing. And so to be able to have people on the team, maybe not always, but even acting as subject matter experts on occasion, I think can be really, really beneficial. And I think regardless of who's on the team, it's real. I mean, not regardless, but whoever's on your team is really needing to be reflective of your community, and some people who are willing to be engaged both on the individual level as well as within their systems. And so each of those people, they bring their own expertise. If they're patrol, they have their own lens that they've been trained in on. As an advocate, you're coming with your own space. Prosecution, brings their own level of expertise and their role within the system, right? But people are coming together to try to figure out how can we do this all better, knowing that we're coming from very different perspectives, that we have different people who we are accountable to, and different things that guide the way that we can work. And so with that, we need to talk about, what is the purpose? So we talked a little bit already, hey, it's a multidisciplinary team trying to improve the response, but what do they really do? And that can vary greatly, between communities. At their heart, as we talked about already, that cross-training coordination, at the simplest level, that can be what people do. But really, to be able to dive deeper and to collaboratively identify those gaps within a system to streamline the response. And that's really focusing on reducing potential harm to survivors or potential survivors, potential victims of sexual assault, as well as increasing that continued support. And not mentioned here, I think it's on the next slide, but really, what does it mean to create a safe community and to hold offenders accountable? And what does that really mean within our own tribal communities? What does accountability look like when it may be somebody that you love who has, caused such immense harm to people? Providing victim-centered responses. So really thinking about what that means. And I think that if you ask people on a SART, what does it mean to be victim-centered? That will vary so drastically. And I think that even coming to a common understanding about what you mean by these phrases, such as, trauma-informed, people are going to have very different answers. If you had at a SART meeting, it's truly one of my favorite things to do is just to ask people to break down some of these words that you say you are doing. Like, yeah, we're providing trauma-informed, victim-centered responses. What does that mean? And having people really unpack where they're coming from and kind of come to some common ground. Because even though we have all these differences, you're in this space together for a common goal. And that is so important, is to have that shared vision, regardless of what your own personal stake may be within the space. starts to do a lot of different things, including like clarifying jurisdictional challenges. That's something that I see, like, especially when I was working on those 5 different SARTs. Where does jurisdiction play into things? And especially, you know, when some of the communities I was working with were PL 280 and some were non-PL 280, all those different nuances. We had 5 different counties, 3 different reservations, all of that. And so really trying to streamline that the systems responders are bearing the brunt of the chaos that can come with jurisdiction, and not having that have to be, you know, having survivors be bounced around to really be helping to streamline that system. Develop multidisciplinary protocols. And when I say that, I mean, yes, each discipline needs their own protocol about how they are going to be responding to sexual assault. But for me, what's really important is thinking about, like, where do those pieces fit in together, and how can you strengthen and sustain practices where people aren't going to fall through the gaps, where there is a lot of communication across systems. And if there's issues, that you can really be talking about things. And so where are those collaboration points that you can find? Develop agency to agency relationships is one of those key things when it comes to SARTs, because often communities, and once again, even though I'm working with rural communities right now, and it's very true as well, in urban and rural spaces and in reservation communities, you're often seeing people who have good relations, like, you know, they have their law enforcement that we go to. I always had that, you know, I had my one law enforcement from each kind of place who was my go-to person, or I had my prosecutor who I'd pull in whenever I needed something, or just for any kind of advice and things like that. But that was really a person-to-person response. But really, what is that agency to agency response? So when I leave a space, or when somebody else leaves, is there still a relationship in place where people are able to kind of keep things moving forward? And so, well, individual relationships are key. That relative to relative connection is so important. At the same point, we need to have systems working well together, and organizations and nonprofits and agencies, you know, having that shared understanding. Because if you're also only having folks who may be doing some of that direct service who are getting along great, but the people at the top aren't, there's going to be issues down the line. And especially when there's power dynamics into play, which often happens within SARTs. Different accountability measures and ways to address when things go wrong. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about SARTs is, you know, I've worked in some communities where, you know, every time something used to go wrong, they would just get petty and bitter and make comments about how so-and-so dropped the ball, or they don't care about survivors and all this kind of stuff. Or like, why aren't you doing what you're supposed to be doing? But after having a SART and after doing some deep, intense work, people were more able to be like, oh, we can actually have healthy conversation when something goes wrong. And it's both naming when harm has been caused, but also really working to address it in the future to make sure that does not impact the people on the team, and more importantly, survivors and community moving forward. One thing I don't think people do enough is support those shared successes. So when things go right, when there are bits of joy, when you are seeing the system be working for some survivors, I mean, whatever it is, I think that people need to be like, we did good. And I think that there's always stuff that you can do to improve and continue. But I think that sometimes you do need to take that pause, and you need to, even though it can be so hard, you know, when humility is something that can be so ingrained in us, but to really be like, we named this, we did this, there's still work to be done, but we have to take that moment to celebrate. And this is something that has been growing within a lot of communities that I've been working with probably over the last like 3-4 years, of is really how our SART's a vehicle to improve community trust and really address the narrative around the response, especially when there has been harm that has been caused within a community. I worked with one of the communities that I worked in, you know, for many years, law enforcement was sexually abusing Native women that they would pull over. And so there was deeply ingrained and valid mistrust of law enforcement. Even though, you know, that situation was 20 years ago, it was still palpable because people were still in that community. And so I think one of the things that community really was working on is how do we address this, and how do we make it so people are actually wanting and feeling safe to, if they want to engage in this form of justice. And so having those conversations within your community and really helping to shape the narrative, not to spin things in a positive way that the system's always right and that advocates don't mess up or that medical is always perfect or anything like that, but just this idea that what people say in community is so important, because if somebody heard, hey, you know, this is what happened to me, but when I went to the hospital, I had an advocate there who supported me. I had a nurse there who was amazing. I had law enforcement who understood and who listened to me. When that happens to somebody else in their life and they share that, that can maybe have somebody else be able to access the medical forensic care they may need, or the advocacy that they may need, or if they want to be reporting to law enforcement, to go that route and have a little bit of trust that they will be listened to and they will be believed within that space. Another part is surely the evaluation of the response within your community. A lot of folks do that through case file review. Some people do that through active cases, but I love, one of my favorite things in the world is looking at texts such as old cases that have been closed, looking at a bunch of them and seeing what can we do better? What are we learning from those gaps within the system? Or where are those things where things were consistently done well, and how can we take that and make that work in other parts of the system? And also, as part of the evaluation of the response is really that survivor and community input. And thinking about ways of doing that that are really engaging in your community, while understanding that we live in a world where people move. A lot of folks don't stay in their same community. Some people will always be there, but some people, you know, they leave. And so you may not be able to, you know, hear from them 5 years later, even 3 years later after their assault. But really thinking about how are you talking to survivors and how are you talking to community, as well as not just, you know, handing them a survey at the hospital that they sign like in that moment, but really thinking about how are you engaging at different points of access along the way, and building with people. So. All right, and so one of the keys to, you know, having an effective start. Some of this information is pulled from some research that was done that I know we'll add it into the chat, but the National Sexual Violence Resource Center has an online kind of compendium or library of resources around SARTs. And this is pulled from resources from there, but those key to effective SARTs is one is that continuous improvement. As we talked about before with people who have those protocol teams, I've been seeing people get very bored. They would spend 5, 6, 7, 8 years writing a protocol. They would implement, they do some trainings on it, and then they would just start over again. But it didn't really feel that much was really being done. That was, for one thing, fun, which, I mean, a lot of our work isn't fun, but if you're going to be attending a meeting and putting in your time, energy, heart, you want to have it be enjoyable in some sort of way. But they also weren't seeing any changes happening within their community. They weren't seeing things where it's actually impacting survivors, wasn't seeing things where they could have any kind of measure about, you know, offenders getting being held accountable, or anything. And so, but they would just do these protocols. And so their system worked fine, but they weren't really moving anywhere. And so, like the seasons, like our life, you know, SARTs are cyclical. They're not linear. And so there's ebbs and flows, even like with a group development. And I think that, you know, some SARTs, you know, they start off so strong, you know, when they're all excited and they're brand new, and then they kind of get into their flow, but then sometimes they just get stuck. And I'm sure some people are in communities, you know, where they have a SART, but they are really stuck. But also within all the work we do, we should be kind of in those moments where, you know, we plan, we really think about, hey, what's happening within our community? What is missing? What do we want to see? And so you have some intentionality. You create an action, you try something new out, you write that new protocol, you do these trainings or whatever it may be. And then you're acting, you're checking. And I think that check stage is what's really important that we often don't do. And I was told one time, you know, that, you know, in our travel communities, we don't have time to do evaluation or to do those checks. And I think that sometimes people think of that as being just such a big thing. Like you have to bring in these researchers and you have to have that university, you have to have all these fancy skills. But it's not. It's really seeing, did what we do work? And sometimes it's just having those conversations or doing a survey or whatever it may be, but really thinking about like, were there unintended consequences of what we did? And what can we learn from this as we move forward? I think there's so many different things that SARTs have the capacity to do. And I think that the power of the collective voices within that space can do so much, but you have to have intentional planning and you have to have a reason about why you're meeting. And that's the thing that I see most about SARTs is that people have really good individual relationships or even system to system relationships, but their SART just doesn't do anything. They meet every month, they do a little bit of check-ins, maybe once a year or so they'll do a fundraiser or a training, but they don't do anything. And for me, that is doing such a disservice to survivors, that we need to be doing more. And that even in those systems where people say everything is going great, I don't believe them. And there's more that can be done within any sort of community to really better meet the needs of survivors. And so one of the things I think is just really important when you're thinking about SARTs, and one of the most beautiful and most powerful things is that understanding of roles. It's also where some of the deepest confusion can come from, is when there is a misunderstanding about the roles of how you're supposed to be together. And so, you know, as I said, every person, every discipline on the SART has a unique role in relationship to the work and to ending sexual violence and to responding to sexual violence, or how they're situated in relationship, you know, to survivors or to offenders. And that means there's different frameworks, there's different ways that we have been trained to enter into space together. You know, like I have my master's in social work, and there are things that I was trained in different ways that I now think about things due to that. Same is said with law enforcement. Prosecutors think through things in a very different lens than advocates most of the time, right? Because we have to, this is how we're trained, and this is what our job is focusing us on. Different laws, especially privacy and confidentiality, and those that we have to follow, and also different things that we're held accountable to. We have different laws that are written around us. We have different people who sign our paychecks. We have, you know, VAWA, we have all these different funding streams as well that we have to be held accountable to. And if we don't, it's not because we're being obstinate or whatever. I've seen a lot of SARTs get really upset because, you know, I've heard like law enforcement or prosecution just getting very angry because advocates aren't able to, like, won't tell them things. They're like, I know you were at the hospital with this person. Why are you not telling me this? And the advocate is like, I can't. And that's true in a couple of reasons, because one, even if you're doing more acute SART work, there still has to be the confidentiality protections put into place, where there has to be, you know, those signed and limited releases. But also, is this the space for it? And even though you may know that this advocate is working with somebody, they have a legal obligation, both due to, you know, if they have state privilege, or if depending on their funding streams, where they can't tell, or they're putting their entire program at risk, which therefore could have a huge impact on survivors across their whole area, right? But so once you're able to have those conversations and to name things, it's a little bit easier. To be able to be like, this is why I can't say things, or this is why I'm operating in the way that I am. And I think that if we were to think about things more as, you know, like a traditional clan system, which many tribes all across Turtle Island have, where all the different clans represent a different space, a different role that you have within your community, and none is higher or better or more important than the other one. But at the same point, you all are coming together and everything is necessary to have your community thrive and grow and work and function the way that it should. And I think that, well, that's not completely translatable, you know, to a SART. The first time I heard that, it was from Bonnie Claremont, who works for the Travel Law and Policy Institute. She presented at a SART conference that I hosted. And it was one of those aha moments where I'm like, oh, we're all on the same page. We just have such different roles, which is a very simplistic way of thinking about it. But to me, it's really beautiful about how we have our protectors and we have our people who sit back and are quiet, and those people who are the voice for advocates. You know, all these different things that we come together for is really what it's about. I think, yeah, minimizing assumptions is one of those other things, is that people assume things about law enforcement or about prosecution or about different parts of the process. And I think that if you can break down those assumptions, you're going to have better and healthier relationships, and that will only improve things within your community. I think that some of the ways that you can kind of help to combat this, if you are on a SART, or even if you're just working collaboratively with people, are having, you know, regular presentations from the different disciplines. So hearing from people from their own lens about why they do what they do and why they handle things in certain ways, and having genuine, curious conversations about things. Because I'm sure we all have questions about, like, oh, this part of the system or this or that. But to be able to have a safe space where you can all have that conversation and dispel those myths is really important. Other things that I really, really love to do are systems mapping exercises or scenarios. Like, from the moment a survivor, you know, walks into the hospital, what happens? And really, you know, it's great if you can have somebody who's visual and is able to draw and all that kind of stuff, but really figuring out what are those areas that, you know, what happens, and not just in those best case scenarios, but in reality, like what happens on the most frantic, you know, Saturday night of the busiest time of the year, like what happens then? And walking through that. And there's going to be areas where you all know a lot about things, and there's going to be other spaces. I was working with a tribe in Arizona, and they knew everything about that initial medical response, the initial advocacy response, the initial like tribal law enforcement response. But then once things got going up into the BIA track, they did not know anything, because so many cases don't go that way. And there's also a lack of communication with those key folks on that part of the system. And so we're realizing that we need to be bringing more people in and trying to figure out different ways of meeting survivors' needs, even if we weren't able to get, you know, certain discipline involved. And so I think that systems mapping can just be it's really fun. And I actually think every community needs to be doing that at times. And so we're not going to have this deep conversation at this point. But I do want people to think about, you know, how does our current response really relate or look different from or similar to what our traditional communities are? You know, how do we respond today to, you know, the offenders of sexual assault and to the victims? But really, like, how can we restore those immediate responses to hold sex offenders accountable? And so I know that people so there's a whole, you know, section of this training about sex offenders, but really, like, how do we respond to people when survivors come to us, when our sisters, aunties, uncles, brothers, anybody, our friends, a stranger, if we were to find out about their sexual assault, how do we respond within our community? And we like to think that people are warm, welcoming, things like that. But I have seen such judgment and such shame come when people come forward, and thinking about our roles as community members within that response, even if we don't have, you know, a paid position or work for this or that. What is our response, and how are we really decolonizing our way of thinking about how we are communicating about sex offenders and about victims? And so, I mean, if somebody is hearing, you know, that what I hear a lot is, you know, like, all sex offenders should be killed. If people are hearing that and they realize that the person who raped them was their uncle, who they love in many ways, are they going to come forward if they're really afraid, you know, that their uncle is going to be killed because of this? And so even just thinking about what are our responses within our communities, as well as within our system, and how can we take away, even though our systems, our law enforcement, our prosecution, whether they're tribal, community, state, federal, county, whatever, they are all set up in the same way that are not led by our traditional values, right? And how can we be taking some of that from, like, even if we're having to work within those systems right now, how can we put more of our Indigenous values and our Indigenous lens within these spaces? Because I feel that that is essential to be able to have survivors get what they need, and also for communities to be safer and healthier, as well as for offenders to really both be held accountable in whatever way that means, as well as to be able to hopefully get any kind of help that they need themselves. And so, what guides the work of a SART? And I think that, as we're talking about, everyone's coming at these things from all these different disciplines and these different frameworks, having that shared, vision or mission or North Star, whatever you want to call it, that's one of the most important things. And one of the things that I've been slowly starting to work with some SARTs on, because even though my focus is now on sex trafficking, I still am very interested in SART work. So MIWSAC has been wonderful in allowing me to work with some communities. But really thinking about how can we bring our own Indigenous values, the 7 teachings of the grandfathers, just thinking like for me and for my community, and other communities have their own different values and systems that guide them. But thinking about, like, if you're on a SART, like, what does humility really look like within a SART, and how, if you came into spaces with humility, would that shift the way that you were all responding together? If you had a shared understanding or a shared value on your team of love being embedded within your SART, I feel that that could be almost revolutionary if you're entering into those spaces. Having bravery and honesty, and to be having those really tough conversations, even though they are scary and even though there are so many what ifs in spaces, while still having respect. And so all of these things, if you're actually coming together with some level of, these are what we have agreed to, and these are those visions and those values that guide us, whether or not they are truly like Indigenous based like this, or not, because sometimes maybe these aren't going to work if you're part of, a large urban SART who you own, like your community has, like 1% Indigenous people within your community. Maybe not having things be guided by this, it may be a harder sell, but at the same point, like, having shared values is what's really important as people are coming together. And so for me, supporting survivors is a SART. We talked a little bit about this, but trauma informed, what does that really mean for your SART? For survivors and for community, because this is one of those words that means so much, but it gets used so often that it kind of strips it away. But to be genuinely trauma informed, also, how are you being trauma informed as a SART? Recognizing that many people on your table, not just advocacy, but law enforcement, prosecution, other people at the table, they may be survivors themselves, and they may be working through their own things. And how are we able to really be trauma informed and be in space and community with each other? Survivor centered. What are those strengths in your program or community that make that possible? And so even if you don't have a SART in this kind of same way, like, what are those things that are really good in your community, and how can you leverage that? And how can you have that help you be more guided by what survivors really need, and not just sometimes what we assume survivors need? Recognizing that everybody has a part, and how will you support each other in that learning process? How are you really going to be there when there are going to be those messy times where some people are learning slower or learning differently or learning in ways that you just don't understand? How are you going to be supporting each other? And how are staff at your organizations going to be informed of changes? Regardless of the size of your community, there's only going to be a finite amount of people who are going to be at the table at the monthly SART meeting or bi-monthly or quarterly, whatever you have. But how are the other staff? How are those people at your organization or in law enforcement going to be informed of the changes that happen from the SART? How are you going to keep it moving and growing and embedded? And also, culturally appropriate and culturally driven. What does that look like really in tribal SARTs, where I think that we have a lot more potential and a lot more growth, but also how do you do that in non-tribal SARTs? Because often, I've worked with so many different SARTs, and what they have is, they have their whole protocol written out, and they have like this little like 2-page section on like how to work with Black survivors, how to work with deaf or hard of hearing survivors, how to work with Native survivors. And no one should be that afterthought. And all protocols, policies, practices should be embedded with those cultural uniquenesses throughout the entire place, throughout the entire protocol. It should be shaped around, it should be designed around all people, and not just that best case scenario survivor that I've seen a lot of people do. I've talked with a lot of SARTs, and when they are picturing, when they're writing their protocols, many of them have said to me that they are picturing, like a 20-year-old white college student who is sexually assaulted at a party. And that's the framework they enter into writing their protocol through, which is doing such a disservice and not really creating a system that is going to meet the needs of survivors, of most survivors. So what do survivors need? And really, I think that whole medicine wheel, and I think that a lot of that should be able to be represented within the SART, both within the makeup of who's on the SART, but also in the actions and the conversations that are had on a SART. I really think it's also important that people know how sexual assault and sexual violence overlaps with, but is really at the heart different from other forms of violence. And that's including domestic violence. There've been, for folks who, like the SADI reports, the Sexual Assault Demonstration Initiative, really brought to light something that we've all known for many years, is that within dual or multi-service agencies, sexual assault is often seen as that like side note, or that, they have one staff that focuses on sexual assault because, the crisis needs of domestic violence victims are so much greater. But often, that means that they have one person who can provide that support. And when that one person leaves, everything just falls apart. So by knowing what the uniquenesses are about sexual assault, which is why I love, being a part of a tribal coalition that is only focused on sexual assault. I find it to just be really beautiful, because we can hone in and we can talk about what are those unique things about sexual assault that, well, there's overlaps, and many, cases of domestic violence, contain sexual assault, all these other things, that we are able to really take that time and really meet the needs. And really that there's not a one size fits all approach. Every survivor is unique. And I see, people who want their protocols to be like step by step guides of what they do. But that's not always going to be possible, because life is really messy. Situations are messy, and even the best protocol for law enforcement or advocacy or anybody, there's going to be some deviation, and there's going to be some humanness that comes with things. And so, but want to make sure that you're preparing all the responders in your community to be able to meet those needs. And that's sometimes even if, in very rural communities, where they get one sexual assault coming forward, once every 2 years. And that can be really hard. And how are you still building momentum when things are are coming forward so rarely, or just because you're in such a rural space? And also people who understand those unique needs of Native survivors, both on the res and off. So like, what are we able to do? How are we able to really keep people informed, and thinking also like both about the higher rates and all that kind of stuff, but really about what does healing look like? What does joy look like? What are those strengths that people bring to the table? I think that survivors need that ability to offer feedback and to influence change. I think that having survivors as part of a SART, be it in an advisory panel sort of way, or just getting regular feedback and buy-in, is so essential to creating that lasting change within community. I think that survivors need SARTs to know about current and emerging trends, and not just like chasing after, shiny things that come along where there's some money attached to this or that, but really just knowing what's shifting. And if there's new ways of doing things that have been shown to be effective, you can try it out. It may not work in your community, but for people who are curious and who want to do good, as well as resources, local, tribal, state, national, there's so many people out there that we can all be better connecting with. to meet those needs of survivors. And I think that sometimes SARTs feel very like insular, like they're alone, like our community is so unique and we need to like trudge through this by ourselves. But at the same point, you're not. There's communities all across your state, your region, you're everywhere, that are dealing with some of the same things, and maybe not always just specifically, but you have people who you can bounce ideas off of, or people who have had that, been there, done that, and who can try things with you. And I think that that's what's really important, is just trying. And so kind of at the heart of it, you know, I've just kind of rambled. I love talking about SARTs. I find them to be flawed but beautiful ways of people coming together to create change. And I think there's so many ways we can grow and expand what we mean by SART work. But really, when I'm thinking about for advocates, what's really important to know, first of all, is there a SART or other sort of collaboration in your community? If yes, are you or your organization on it, or can or should you join? And if not, why isn't there a SART? And I'm not saying that every community needs one, you know, but what is happening or what's in its place? Should there be a SART? Did you have one 10 years ago and it kind of, you know, imploded? Because that happens in some communities. Sometimes they also explode, which is a little bit scarier at times. But should there be one? Are there already enough mechanisms in place that you have ways of communicating and you have ways of creating change without that sort of SART-esque meeting? How do you as an organization or program relay internal changes to partner programs? I've seen people who've changed their crisis line number, but had no real way of getting that number out to different people in their community. It's a university who has changed the way that they're handling their internal response. How do they let people know? And how do you get information from other people? And so really thinking about that. Also, you know, I think it's important for advocates to know when something goes wrong, how do you bring it up to partners? That's not just sitting around internally and, you know, getting annoyed or making complaints internally about things. Like, how do you actually create change? How do you bring forward issues that may be uncomfortable? Or how do you bring up issues that are big and systemic and you've seen this repeated gap? And how do you actually talk about it to create change? And also when something goes right, how do you celebrate that success? When something actually, I don't know, I just think something I've been really trying to think a lot more about, and I've had some really amazing conversations with advocates and folks about how can we bring more joy into our spaces, because we work with such serious subjects and things that are gut-wrenching and personal and things that can consume you with some of that like anger and negativity, which is right. It's real and it's right there, right? But how do you also bring a little bit of joy and celebration even to something like a SART? How do you bring that in there? The rest of this is just kind of little bits about some of the differences between, you know, what systems, the difference in systems responses and traditional community responses really are. But I think at the heart of it is that we really need to figure out how we can do better to meet the needs of survivors. And one of those ways is to, I'm trying to think, no, that's all. I'm just going to stop that. And one of those ways is to really just be together and to have good, honest communication. I think that for regardless if you are just a brand new SART, or if you're somebody who, you know, is a program manager, or if you're just a community member who cares a lot because you're seeing harm done in your community, I think the most important things that can be done to improve the system response is have communication and try to talk. And that's going to hit some roadblocks in some communities. I've worked in spaces where, you know, they were never, probably for, you know, the next 5-10 years may never get law enforcement or another discipline on their table or at their table. And so, but still, you know, even if you're missing one of those key players within your community response, what can be done? I see so many people get disheartened, and it's really hard sometimes to think about if you're missing a huge component, what can you do? But we need to do something. Survivors need us to figure out some way of filling that gap or working around it or just meeting their needs without that. And I think that for me is one of the most beautiful things about advocates is the tenacity as well as the creativity that has to come with our work. And I think that together, collectively, we are able to do some really cool things. So that was my hour TED Talk on SARTs, and it's barely touching the surface of all I want to say. But we have a couple of minutes. If anybody has any kind of questions or anything like that, I'm here.
So Julie, there was a wonderful statement. It was at 4:09, so it was a few minutes ago, but Tamara said, I love that way of thinking for creating protocols. No one should be an afterthought. So that was a comment.
Yeah, if I could say one thing about creating protocols is don't do that. Like don't just have people be a little like a little in the appendix. So. All right, well, I will put my email in the chat, and I'm always here to be able to talk with people. We have other people on staff also who have had previous SART experience, but we really want to have this space. You know, we are now trying, like originally we used to do this part like way before we had any of the other sections about the different, you know, unique disciplines. But we thought that, you know, it's better now to have it afterwards so we can kind of think about, so yeah, we've learned about all these individual pieces, but now really how can they come together to create change and to be vehicles for social change and even activism. And if we're really wanting to rethink, how could we like just dismantle that and have it really be community driven? And what does a community led and community driven response look like in our tribal communities? So thank you all for having me today. I don't know who is facilitating this next section, but I do believe that there is a break scheduled at this point. So MIWSACers?
Yeah, so it's 4:19. Let's take our 11 minutes. So, well, I'm on the East Coast, so let's come back at 4:30 Eastern, 3:30 Central, I'm trying to do this, 2:30 Mountain, and 1:30 Pacific. So 11 minutes, let's take a break, and then we'll just come back and dig in. Thank you. Enjoy your break. Get some water, do all the things that make you feel good. All right, then, let's work our way back online. It's 4:30 Eastern, 3:30 Central. This is Rebecca Baylock talking. So yeah, let's work our way back for the next minute or so. Thank you. Debbie, I'd like to say thank you for your interpretation today. Thank you so much. All right. And fix the spotlight issue that's happening right now. Sorry, I don't know what you all see. You see the screen? Let me know in the chat, please.
Yeah, we see the screen.
Awesome, thank you. Okay. Right, let's give it just one more minute for folks to come back and like get some water, do all the things. All right then, so welcome. Hey, I'm Big Day. Good day to everyone. My name is Rebecca Baylock. I'll do a little bit of an intro later. I know it's been a long day, but these 40 hours have so much great information and so much difficulty and the challenge of this great work that we do as a family and as a team in this movement of ending violence, whether you're a domestic violence, sexual violence, sex trafficking, or many other disciplines. They're all really relative and relevant to ending the intersectional violence. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to smudge for us. And then I'm going to do a little bit of a wellness exercise because it's the end of the day, so we're going to take care of each other and ourselves. If you have smudge available, let's do this thing together, right? Got my cedar, I got my prairie sage. We're going to do things. And if you don't have any accessible, it's all right too, because I'm sending this to you. Isn't that what we do during COVID? We do smudging online, digital smudge prayers, and just, lift up that smoke together in a good way. It smells so right. Just sets my head right straight away. So I'm sending this all to you. It's hard work we do. We got to take care of ourselves. Yes. Right. Thank you so much for that. So right now we're going to transition to the last module of the day, the impact of sexual assault and survival. And, some folks don't, we've learned a lot over the years that some people are like, I'm not a victim. So they don't like the victimization language. So I did update this title. Some folks choose to identify as survivors. So I made this a dual intro that survivors or victims, however an individual describes themselves, is all good. But it's that understanding and that acceptance of that self-identification that's a part of this work. So we're going to have a bit of a conversational time. I know it's the end of the day. You can undo your mute button and talk on audio. You can do video, or if you're just burnt and fried. It's been a long day. You can do it in the chat. We'll keep an eye on that too. But we really want to understand together how we respond to the many, many impacts. Ooh, this echo. The many impacts and responses to sexual violence and all of the intersections that come with it. So this is a general slide, the goals and objectives. First, I want to introduce myself. I'm Faith Washday. I'm happy to be here. Good day to you all. I am in the Appalachian Mountains of Pennsylvania, where my family has lived for many generations. Many generations have lived under the shadow of the Carlisle Indian School. It's 10 minutes from my house. My Mohawk granny lived 10 minutes in the southern region of Pennsylvania under the Carlisle Indian School. My great uncle died in a tuberculosis ward of Carlisle Indian School that was just off campus, and a lot of people don't know that. So it's very unique, the boarding school experience that was born out of Carlisle. I am a survivor advocate. I'm a survivor, not a victim, of child abuse, domestic violence, sexual violence, rape. And I've worked I'm not a sex trafficking survivor. I won't claim that, but I did work in bars and clubs that tantalized that identity, where things were happening around me. So I do have firsthand understanding on that. At MIWSAC, I've been here for 2.5 years. And I do the sex trafficking in Indian country and Alaska OVW project. So I'm really grateful to be here in this wonderful organization. So that's my intro. I also have sons. I'm a woman in an ocean of men in my house. So I also love the slides that are going to be included in our conversation today to talk about men and boys and Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ folks, because that's a part of our conversation in general, and it always should be. So no Indian is left behind. But our goal is really to identify all of these impacts, everything that I've talked about so far, which is the wide variety of responses that we approach ending sexual violence, and how we're talking about children and youth, how we're talking about advocacy, and how we're supporting our families from, let's be honest, Indian country is a political identifier, and that means sovereign nations. Totally. I'm putting that first, that is a political identity, that citizenship and membership of tribal sovereignty and the nations. However, we have, I think the last census was 22% of Native folks lived on reservations, while the other 78% were in urban, that just means cities, rural, mountains, the country, the prairie, suburban, right? That's just true to life, and reservation, right? So we have this diversity. So our variety of responses really need to be tailored to the survivors and victims that come forward living in a world that may not be in our advocacy zone. We need to diversify even that when we talk about variety with sexual assault in general. And Jolene had talked about this earlier in the previous conversation, that, sexual violence is its own pillar, not pillar, I'm not trying to make it grandiose, but it's its own tract or basket. But sexual violence does happen in domestic violence. Sexual violence certainly happens in sex trafficking. Sexual violence certainly happens in child abuse. It happens in marriages. It happens in teen dating violence. So there's all of these different aspects to sexual violence that when it comes to youth and parenting and the broken systems since the Carlisle boarding school experience, it's very diverse. How do we be all things all the time for everyone? And the answer is networking, building our huge, like Iktomi, the spider, building a network, a web of support systems across Indian country, MIWSAC, whatever tribal program or non-tribal program you're working for, that we're building the networks we need to do this work right. So our learning objectives: to recognize everything I just kind of laid out and understand everything I laid out, that variety and diversity, and understanding the impact of sexual assault abuses across that huge, I think the word they use is spectrum. It's like this huge wide rainbow, all the colors from left to right, from horizon to horizon. And then realize the responses are also going to vary depending on each individual. Are they from a rural community in the mountains or the prairie? Are they from like the valley, right? Like they're suburban communities? Is it inner city where, you know, there's a different language and lifestyle and problems that are way different than rural communities? Or is it reservation? All of these things matter at the same time, equally, because at any moment, this diversity could walk in the door and ask for help, and we have to be prepared. So I'm going to take a breath. So let's, before I go into this one, I would just like everyone to take a big inhale, like we're going to have a wellness moment because it's the end of the day. So a deep inhale, hold it for 3 seconds and exhale it out. That's all I'm asking. Just 1, 2, 3. Hold it. 1, 2, 3. Let's do it one more time. Inhale. This is how we practice teeny tiny little self-care while we're talking about these really difficult things. So Wopila, thank you so much for that. So back to these slides, right? So what is the impact of sexual assault? So the impact does vary on identity, right? When it's committed by someone that a survivor or victim knows and trusts. And that is a really long journey that was talked about earlier with the mental health that Linda, thank you, Miss Linda, that you had talked about mental health. When it's a stranger danger, that is so different than having someone you know that has harmed you. So we want to talk about the type and the amount of force used, because these are the facts that go into the legal system that doesn't always work for Native folks. Again, the circumstances of the assault, again, is a part of our healing journey, that Changleshka, that medicine wheel of mind, body, emotion, and spirit. But it also goes into the judicial system of court and investigation and the paper trails. What is the relationship with any offender? That matters too in those two worlds we walk in of traditional indigeneity and then the court system. And then we talked about this too earlier with Miss Linda, the heightened feelings of self-blame and guilt, and how our communities can often be a part of that, igniting self-blame, guilt, and re-victimization and victim blaming and gossip and all of those things. So it's not always this internal process. Our external support systems, if they show up for us, that helps us process, right? We know this. If the external world we're living in, it doesn't matter if you're in suburbia or a city or the res or in the mountains, your external support system is going to influence if you have guilt or self-blame. And that's huge. And that's the language that we approach survivors with, that like, I hear you, say what you need to say. We understand these dynamics. I have a bar in my way. Okay, impact of sexual assault by a stranger. Fear, most difficult emotions to manage. Yeah, if it's stranger danger, you're afraid of dark corners. Any trigger of that environment and that atmosphere of surviving can stay with an individual. And then the feelings of vulnerability. Yeah. So I was going to go through a storytelling, but I'm just not. I'm going to withhold and do. So I added this slide, and this is intentional. I just added this about an hour ago. So Indigenous survival and thriving. Storytelling moment. I hope we're conversational, either in the chat, on audio or visual, whatever you feel comfortable with, that are based on your prayer, your respect, compassion and honesty, generosity and humility. Because these, for Lakota folks, but also I think the Hopi have 7. I think the Seminole have 4 or 5. So each nation has their own changleshka, the medicine wheel, different colors, different amounts of quadrants or sections in the medicine wheel. So I want to honor that and not make this Lakota centric. But we have our values, and that goes from environmentalism, reproductive justice, domestic violence, sexual violence, structure of leadership. We understand our people, and we're more common than separate. So I put this here because it resonates with myself in the storytelling moment and who I'm speaking about. So before we go into the rest of the slides that are quite conversational, I'm going to give an example, and this is a real life, but I'm going to maintain confidentiality along the way. So in Canada, tribes are called bands. I'm living in central Pennsylvania. There's no state tribe. There's no federally recognized tribe. There's just the Carlisle Indian School and many of us descendants and folks that have moved here. Okay, so that's the baseline. In the late 1960s, there were 2 twin girls living in a Canadian band. And they were just hanging out. Sorry, IT stuff. They were just hanging out at their home on the reservation land in Canada. And a car drove up to the reservation home, and white people walked out, not racist, just facts, no effery. And they said, there is a birthday party, and we would like your children to come to this birthday party celebration in the tribal community. So 1960s, it was a different time, right? Like you could go out and play till the street lights went out or the sun went down. It was just a different time. So the twins got in the car with the native mother's blessing. They got in the car, they drove, they got straight to the airport and were taken out of Canada to Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, which is 60 minutes from my home, where I sit right now. There was no NICWA, there was no ICWA, there was no tracking of adoption or foster care. These 2 little girls were stolen from a band in Canada and just flown to Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where they were separated and each adopted out. Illegally, traumatically, awfully. Born and raised, not born, but raised up in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, under the shadow of the Carlisle Indian School, which they learned about through the local intertribal community that exists. Raised in white homes, ended up becoming mothers themselves through all of the trauma and disconnect from their own culture from Canada. Gave birth, had another daughter. The daughter grew up in the middle of this intertribal community without tribal roots. And some of us just understand what that means. If you have been an orphan from your culture and had to relearn. At the end of the day, Indigenous woman meets another Indigenous man who grew up in a different foster care scenario all the way on the West Coast, flew out to the East Coast with all of the trauma during NICWA that was not honored, was not covered. No one had this young man's back, and he was sexually assaulted his entire childhood in the foster care system on the West Coast. He moves to Pennsylvania too. They fell in love online. At the end of the day, his trauma was so intense that when babies were born, I'm going to sludge. When his children were born, and this is in the mid 2000s, he abused, the baby was crying. He didn't have the safety net. He didn't have the support as a survivor of his own abuse, nor did the grown woman who gave birth to the children. all of this intergenerational trauma is just happening, and go to the hospital and the baby almost dies from shaking syndrome. So the Indigenous man goes to jail in Pennsylvania in the mid-2000s. So we're talking, this started from the 1960s, unsupervised, uncaught, unmoderated. 1960s generation, another generation, and now we have the next generation of babies in the hospital that almost died. I walked into that hospital, visited the family, and there were CPS workers there. And I looked at them, and you just know, you can tell when you're working with caseworkers that don't understand Indigenous lifeways and intergenerational trauma. So the little girl is on life support. She did survive, so it's a happy end. This is a happy ending. I just want to say that. The little boy was, in a room, being, getting medical treatment as he needed, and the little girl was on life support, but she came through. And these CPS workers came in, and I looked at them and I said, this woman is a domestic violence survivor from intergenerational trauma, from this man who's surviving intergenerational trauma and his own childhood trauma from the foster care system. We are Native people. And I looked at him, I said, oh my God, you're going to charge her. And they charged her, and they took her children away. So we're going to get into this later, but I wanted to talk about the surviving and thriving that Indigenous folks need to go through. And I know this is a very specific storytelling, but I would bet my bottom dollar that every single person on this call has a similar story of people they know, family members they know, or even themselves that have gone through this system failure that has harmed generations of our families. And that's what we're going to get into later. So at the end of the day, those two children survived and are doing great. Yes, daddy went to jail. He is on a wellness journey now, which is wonderful. They are now my godchildren. I was going to adopt them, but I chose to go through NICWA, and now they're Athabascans living in a village in Alaska. So it was a really great ending to this generational trauma. But if we keep doing this work with our Indigenous virtues, we can start healing generations. And then these babies are going to grow up in a healthier way and end that cycle, because the system failed us, not indigeneity. Okay, so that was very long, but I wanted that storytelling to be the foundation of everything we're going to go through in these next slides. I'm going to take a breath. All right, we're burning, we're good. Let's smoke up. Okay, next. So I know that was heavy. Please smudge and drink your water. Like I said, I know we all have stories to tell. If you'd like to chime in, that's wonderful. Unmute, interrupt me. I'm never going to be offended by that. Okay, thank you. Yes, the deep collaboration with PL280. Yes, thank you for all the comments. Like I said, interrupt. I'm down for it. And for the table discussion, so when it comes to sexual violence, what acts of sexual violence are you seeing in your community? It's 2022, the world has changed with COVID, but some things just never change, right? So who are the primary victims? Please add in the chat or unmute. Who are your primary victims that you're seeing in your programs? And who are the primary harm doers? Please add in the chat. And are you collecting like the demographics? You know how we have to do reporting. We have to do demographics, age groups, gender identity, all the things, right? Young women and boys, lots of women, although not always. I appreciate that. Disabled, Summer, thank you so much for saying that. It's very true. I was just in an international sex trafficking report conference, and one of the things that they saw grow so much since COVID was disability communities in sex trafficking and sexual violence. So Summer, that I appreciate that a lot. Transgender, thank you. Young teenage girls with no mom or dad in the home. Yep. Yep. Vulnerable folks, lonely, suffering from depression or trauma. True. Vulnerable populations. And in other circles in the movement, the title that's used a lot is the margins of the margins. That means Black, Indigenous, Asian, any people of color or sexual identity that are also youth and runaway. It's the margins of the margins of the margins. So it's good to remember that language. Lonely and suffering, yep. Young people, mostly women or non-binary folks and folks experiencing homelessness. Oh my goodness, yes. There it is, Mariana. Young, the youth with the margin of also being LGBTQAI or Two-Spirit, their experiences aren't heard, right? Because we don't have a lot of shelters built for that. We have a lot of domestic violence shelters. We have rooms within those shelters for sexual violence survivors. Not so many for sex trafficking, but then intersect that with being Two-Spirit or Native LGBTQ or non-binary, where the rules are still on the books that if you're a 14-year-old born male, you're not allowed to come into the shelter. Like, who, what? Yeah, we're still kind of there. Harm doers, licensed foster home providers, Victoria. Yes, it's almost like state-run human trafficking because there's money involved. Licensed foster home providers, trusted people, some not so trusted, keep getting out and are protected by the sovereignty issues or state law or who you know. Yep, we saw that in Lakota country in South Dakota a few years ago, Lakota Law Project. People with substance abuse addictions and dependencies. Yep, that vulnerability, that's a recruitment tactic, is to utilize that vulnerability and that disability or disease. Folks trying to escape other types of violence, homelessness, domestic violence, emotional abuse, correct? Thank you so much. So I think we talked about the gender spectrum. When we talk about the gender spectrum, so I had just brought this up because there was a high profile case out in the world, on the internet, whatever. And there were studies, the last percentages, which were really enlightening the way we do our work, that women and girls, we understand our histories. Oh my goodness, yes, we know how the world works and how it has with male privilege and power and control and misogyny. But we also understand that gender isn't always this key factor in the demographics of sexual violence. So I did a little research because I don't like talking about things I don't know what I'm talking about. So I researched like a nerd, sorry. And I found that it was like 81% of women and girls have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. And this is like all people. This is mainstream, people of color, binary, gender identities, Two-Spirit, LGBTQ, like the spectrum in this research. And then it was like 83.4% of self-identified men had experienced sexual violence. So that was very interesting to see how the numbers were just, and I know underreporting happens all the time. So that's a little toss back disclaimer, but the numbers really are equitable, that sexual violence can affect everyone. And that when we're doing this work, we want to be good relatives to all of our relatives and be very intentional with our language to make sure that no one's a throwback or during Jolene's presentation, no one's an afterthought, that we're being inclusive in that because men and boys do experience sexual violence. And who are the primary victims? Men and boys. It's right there in the text. And the primary harm doers can be anyone, right? That spectrum is still here. Like it's not beautiful like a rainbow, but the spectrum is still rainbow-ish. And the same thing with the gender spectrum. we do, like I had just mentioned, we do know that shelters don't take people or individuals that their driver's license or ID. This actually happened when I was doing direct service in a city. Someone came in beaten and bruised by a police officer, and they came in and they made it through 45 minutes of the intake for a shelter bed to save their life. But their driver's license said, you know, I'm going to lie right now for confidentiality, but their driver's license said Michael. And they immediately got kicked out because they were a male over the age of 14 who was a transgender woman. So like that's still happening because policies and procedures aren't written to be inclusive. So we got to figure that out. And others who are targeted who anyone at any time. That's the inclusive piece, that we're that spectrum of inclusivity and love and compassion and bravery and truth and wisdom, like those 7 Lakota virtues I talked about earlier. Oh, more messages. Harm doers, folks deep down feel powerless in other ways. Yes, like at work or even at home. So they exert power by harming others in the community. Mary, I really appreciate that because it reminds me of a conversation like 15 years ago that was talking about like Christmas time or when a recession hit, that financial insecurity in a family led to a lot of violence in the home, sexual violence, domestic violence, and all the things that stressors and at Christmas time too really elevated the numbers and statistics. Our shelter recently took in a victim who was trans. That's awesome. Yes. I think there is too much focus on just women, and there needs to be more services for men and boys as well. More harm doers are exposed and more healing on all sides can begin. Yes. If we're only addressing women and girl perpetrators, we are not addressing the ones that are targeting men and boys. Very true. It's all about equity. We keep talking about equality and equity in this world. It's 2022. We're doing racial justice, racial equity. Equity is the name of the day. We got to practice what we preach, right? And I think I'm going to go over time, so I'm going to kind of buzz through some things. So common reactions to sexual assault, survivordom. You know, the acute or like really honed in specific hardcore stuff, dulled sensory effect and memory functions. Storytelling here, just putting my stuff, my ish on the table. I had been raped when I was 16. Like my body language just got weird and I looked down. 16, and I didn't even remember it until I was like 43 years old. Like I didn't even remember it, because that's how our minds and our spirits and our bodies protect us sometimes. So that can be in the court system, that can be clunky and an issue. But at the end of the day, when it comes to counseling and services, our bodies and minds will protect us from things we're not ready to handle. So it's okay if someone says, I don't remember this until now. And then we address that and say, well, what was that process like for you? And just treat it like it happened when they say it happened. Just honor the voice and the heart and the spirit of the person. Because the dulled sensory effect is real. And that's, like I said, it's protecting us. Disorganized thoughts, timelines can get kind of clunky and messed up, and we don't focus on that. We're just going to allow them to release and speak, and they'll put their stuff on the table and they'll compartmentalize and they'll organize it as a part of the healing process, which is really beautiful. Just giving them the space to do that and just be a good friend and a good relative and a good advocate by not pressing, what date did this happen? None of that. Just be kind and loving and compassionate. And more acute, I mean, nausea and vomiting can happen just as an immediate reaction or a memory trigger, right? That's totally real. Paralyzing anxiety or fear, very real, whether it is someone close to the immediate family that was the harm doer, or stranger danger on the street or dark corners, or sleeping with the lights off is very traumatizing. self-washing, right? Confusion and crying, that's, this is a healing journey. Acute sensitivity to reactions of other people. Totally. Some harm doers have a certain way about them, and then you could go to the grocery store and your cashier is saying the same words, the same behaviors, whatever it is, like that can be a trigger. And that's part of that healing journey, is to say, what was that? How did it make me feel? Where did that come from? And how do I work through it? And that's why counseling is such a beautiful thing. So outward adjustment, folks can minimize. It wasn't a big deal. I survived it, whatever. And then, like with me, 30 years later, it all just hit me and I was like, wow. But did I minimize doing sexual violence work? Yeah, I was just doing the work, right? I was a DV and child abuse survivor. But when that hit me, I was like, oh, I've been minimizing, but that was a part of my spirit and my mind, and Tukashila had taken care of me until I was ready to do the work, if that makes sense. Dramatization, can't stop talking about the assault. There's no harm, no foul. People have to process the way they need to. Suppression, people can refuse to discuss. That's another mind, body, spirit, and emotional safety mechanism that we honor that. We cannot force folks to be ready when they're not ready. And we just really want to respect that. Analyzes what happened, another safety mechanism. That mental health, going back to what Linda was talking about in the first module. And this one, flight. Fight, flight, fawn, or freeze. All of them are going to be a part of survivordom, depending on the person's history, their current environment, and their safety. All of them are acceptable, and they're all common. I'm gonna try to speed up a little bit. So hypervigilance is another one. Some folks do not want to get close. They build brick walls. That's fine too. Just the safety, especially if someone in their immediate family or circle growing up was their harm doer. That trust, like, how do you get close to other people after that? Some folks just build brick walls for the safety net, and that's fine. We just want to love, compassion, trust, all of it. Panic attacks can happen, depression, mood swings, rage or hostility, and of course, sleep disturbances. And like Linda's presentation, eating disorders, substance abuse, mental health, all of it is just a part of process for folks. Okay. Try to speed up. Okay, so sexual assault and victimization or survivordom, a wide variety of abuses can happen, right? So it's not just sexual violence like in the movies. There's it's a spectrum, again, that big rainbow. Exposure, public masturbation, voyeurism. Since COVID, sexual violence, sex trafficking violence that is happening online is voyeurism, it's porn, it's digital recruiting, entrapment, revenge porn. All of these things have really entered this digital space, so that voyeurism could have 50 bullets underneath it, for real, in 2022. Ritual abuse, and we'll talk about that a little bit too in the spiritual leadership and spiritual abuse on Thursday. And then that digital goes into the voyeurism. So the voyeurism can be face-to-face, but also that digital, again, it could be 50 bullets. Pornography, same thing. Commercial exploitation, again, same wheelhouse. And then exploitation by professionals, same wheelhouse. Sex trafficking, sexual violence, pornography. These harm doers are multi-billion-dollar industries at this point, especially since COVID. And we'll talk about that during the sex trafficking module. Okay, impact of sexual assault on family and secondary survivors. So this is really big because you are also a secondary survivor as an advocate, so you have to take care of yourself. like a parent or a sibling or a friend or a cousin. Like, we have these moments with these survivors, these individuals, but then we have this village around them that love and care. And it can be very difficult to navigate a survivor who is disclosing, who may receive retaliation, who may have gossip, like we talked about earlier, again, with Linda's module, that sexual assault does not only impact the victim, it's as far reaching to the non-offending family, friends, and entire community. And that's that disease that is gossip. It's bad medicine because we've survived centuries of silence, and we are now getting to this place where the grandmothers of this movement, and this movement's only 40 years old, right? Our aunties and grandmothers invented this. They created it. They fought for us to start ending silence, and we keep doing better every year. And the next generation's even going to fall out and do better than us. That there's no shame in disclosing, and that gossip and that harm doing that happens with a harm doer's mom or auntie or cousin that are going to fight folks that are surviving. You know, we got to end that in our drum groups, in rodeos, at basketball or skate jams. We need to start holding folks accountable. And that means no longer silencing survivors because it makes their perp or harm doer look bad. We all know what retaliation looks like, but that's a big part of it. Okay, I'm gonna read some quotes here. I changed the policy in our shelter when I became director. There was so much pushback about being an inclusive shelter. Once it opened as an inclusive of all genders, we had so many more male identified callers and people saw how important it was. Love it. Thank you, Ashley. Victoria, nice, Ashley, see what I mean? Men do suffer a lot of DV from partners and SA and sex trafficking and need to be safe and find services for their and shelter for their partners and unresolved traumas. Yep. And then we have another comment. I personally had someone anonymous from Tinder, online dating, post an online forum for more explicit pictures of me to trade, and ones he then posted and refused to take down. We didn't even date, unmatched months prior. Online is crazy. And they, what do they say? Once something is online, it is forever. Because there's the cloud and there's screenshotting, there's all these things. Yeah, online is just teach everyone, no, don't text or take a picture of anything. So large group, and I'm gonna do every other one because I know we're running out of time. So large group, please unmute if you'd like to chime in, add to the chat a critical look at typical risk assessment forms with Child Protective Services. Again, I'm leaning back to the very first storytelling where Child Protective Services went onto a tribal land in Canada and invited these two twins, I think they were 5 or 6 years old, to a birthday party, drove away, put them on a plane and sent them to Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, into separate foster care homes. And then all of the generational trauma that had followed since then. So with that in mind, a typical form used to assess child abuse or neglect. Each topic has a score for CPS. They just walk in and they start scoring these things. And it's a risk assessment. Number of children in the home, they document. 2 or fewer, 0 points. 3 or more, 1 point. So a risk assessment is if you have 3 or more children. Interesting. So what are the implications for Native families when the more points you have is the more endangerment to your family? What does that look like in Indian country? How many Native families have 3 or more children or grandchildren living in their home? Any thoughts? Most, yep. Multi-generational living, yes. And I know it's different from multi-generational living, yes, but also my mom, my Oglala Mohawk, my daddy's a full-blooded Gypsy, my mom's Oglala and Mohawk, but she had 9 siblings. So it's a generational thing too. But there are many families that have grandma, grandpa, aunties, cousins, mom, dad, and children, and sometimes grandchildren living. And these numbers of 3 or more, it gives a point of a risk assessment, is just bizarre in Indian country. Maybe for mainstream folks too, and other communities of culture and color. Overrepresentation, yep. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so here, typical form used by Child Protective Services, and we know what this means in Indian country. Foster care to mostly non-native homes, even though it's a federal crime to do so. So I'm just going to say that. Typical form used to assess child abuse or neglect. Characteristics of a primary caregiver, okay? Not applicable. I don't even know how you give a point to that on a form, but okay. Lacks parenting skills, because that can be established in one visit. Lacks self-esteem, apathetic or hopeless. Again, lacks parenting skills and self-esteem. That's a double point. Again, weird. Again, lacks esteem and apathetic. Lacks skills, esteem, and apathetic. 3 points. So there's a lot. It's just bizarre. So for the non-offending native parent, we understand the intergenerational trauma, we understand economic issues, we understand substance abuse, and Indian families tend to be large families. Is it a bad day? Is someone sick? Are we losing our housing? Did our car break down? Is there a domestic violence harm doer in the home? Is the non-offending parent a sexual violence survivor? Is there trafficking in the home? All of the intersections that come with life in general, adding into the indigeneity experience. These questions are just bizarre. But they're a part of the risk assessment for a CPS to remove children from their home. Back to that story I told that I opened with. That mom was in the hospital with her 2 children in the hospital. And I knew they were going to take the children from her, even though she was a domestic violence survivor. And they did. So this is just truth in action. And that's just one example. That even though a domestic violence or sexual violence survivor is the non-offending parent, if there is a offending parent, they can remove children from the home and put them in a non-native home. Any thoughts? Okay, thank you, Afton. Characteristics of an abused parent, yes. And the cycles of abuse, yes. Traditional parenting equals lack of parenting skills. Yeah, that's a weird assessment too. That, you know, traditional life ways are quite different and they're not mainstream, and they may not fit into a risk assessment unless they're culturally specific. Okay, so let's just scroll. So implications for change, and I'm gonna wrap up here. For systems change, we understand that NICWA, the National Indian Child Welfare Act, is a part of CPS, Child Protective Services, across Indian country, Alaska, and our relatives in Hawaii. So when we're talking about youth that are in homes where there is violence, that the non-offending parent does not have to be re-victimized by the system and have her children or his or their children removed because there is violence in the home. It's an epidemic. So we really want to keep the systems focused on the actions of the offenders and not the victim. It happened in Pennsylvania. I had to train attorneys on what NICWA was because the children were removed and taken to non-native families after they were released from the hospital, even though mom was just a victim of domestic and sexual violence. Again, there it is, the change, the victim blaming by practitioners. And in this case, that example, that storytelling, it was CPS that victim blamed her, that she allowed this to happen when she wasn't even present during the crime. And how can we paint pictures so that first responders understand the harm that is caused for Indigenous focused folks, which is often quite different than non-Indigenous folks. We need to talk about it in our community. Our advocates have to understand the language to use, the bylaws within the tribal court system, and then also if it's PL 280 or if it happens off tribal land, understand the state laws that the requirements to protect the youth so they're not separated from their non-offending parent, and then change the hurtful responses. And sometimes that just comes right out of the judicial or court system itself. So yeah, I'm gonna stop there. Are there any thoughts or questions or stories that you'd like to share to help other folks understand the impact of child protective services and sexual violence? Thank you. Thank you. So it's 5:22 East Coast time. That was a lot of information. To summarize all of it is that families are going to go through many intersectional things, but at the baseline, the foundation of advocacy work must be protecting the children, the next generation. And I'm coming from the Carlisle boarding school philosophy here, that every generation is going to become the new auntie, uncle, them, grandparents, and parents raising the next generation. So in every facet of our work, the children must always be on our mind and our hearts. And to remember that, like we talked about SARTs, we talked about mental health, we're going to talk about spiritual abuse. The 40-hour covers all of these major topics. But the foundation of our nation's thriving since 1491 is always about the children. So I guess that's my closing thoughts. Anyone else have any thoughts to share? All right, so Christine will have this recording emailed and posted for everyone, and we'll reconvene on Thursday. If anyone wants to stay on and chit chat and visit, I'll stay on with you for a while. Otherwise, we can wrap up. And oh, you're welcome, Victoria. Thank you for your comments. Wopila, Mitakia say to you all. We'll see you on Thursday. And also Wopila Tanka to our, thank you to our ASL interpreters. Thank you.
I have a question, Rebecca.
Hi, Ashley. Go for it.
I haven't been able to follow much of the current political situation with the Child Welfare Act, but what ramifications does that have on the community?
I mean, over the last few decades, it was, it was really bad back in the day. And I mean, like 60s, 70s, and 80s, when children were just, it was a tough time because NICWA is a federal act that no child should be removed from an Indian family. and placed in non-native foster homes or adoption. So the ramification is much like the boarding school experience where children were just removed from their home, removed from their culture. So the ramifications of that is generations long loss of culture, faith, ceremony, language, songs, indigeneity in general, being raised in like suburbia or the urban environment or rural, wherever. So that is a huge cultural issue. However, there's a woman named Sandy Whitehawk who has led this huge, beautiful restorative movement in the restoration of indigeneity for folks that were adopted out into white families that wanted to go home, or they were raised in foster homes that wanted to come home to their tribal land and their communities. And sometimes they met their brothers and sisters and parents for the first time because they were forcefully removed, like the boarding school. So there's a lot of hardship and sad, negative history, but yet people like Sandy are pushing it on to bring folks home, and then their children and their grandchildren. And some of them are getting enrolled and they're sun dancing and they're powwowing and they're learning their language. But it is very interesting. I'm just going to make I statements. In Pennsylvania, we don't have a federally recognized tribe any longer or a state, but we have a huge indigenous community. A lot are descendants from the Carlisle School here. And it was very interesting to have this Canadian daughter that was brought to Lancaster in my storytelling. And then a fostered in many white homes, sexually assaulted Native man from the West Coast come to Pennsylvania. They got married and had these 2 children. And when the hospitalization and the tragedy happened, I'm sitting here and I had to teach these attorneys what NICWA was, which was just crazy to me. That NICWA is so off the beaten path of legalese in America. So yeah, that was interesting.
So but it's being challenged right now, right?
Yeah, it's been challenged. So the Lakota Law Project is one of the really heavy hitters in the baseball game, for lack of a better analogy, that the Lakota Law Project, they fight NICWA a lot because a lot of children are still being removed in 2022 and put into non-native foster homes, where non-native foster homes get money for fostering children, right? And their aunts and uncles and their own families don't get to foster. But yes, it is being challenged. It's just one of those, it's not underground, it's just a part of all the things we're fighting for at the same time, right? Like this changing of the name with the Redskins, the MIWSAC, Standing Rock, water protection, all the things. Like we've got a lot to fight for, but it is on the table, yes.
Yeah, thank you. I noticed that it was like on the table and I was like, so it's just gonna go back to how it was, and it's just awful. So I was just curious like where it was at.
I appreciate that. Thank you. We have, when we're doing advocacy work, we're doing a lot of things at the same time, right? It's like, where does it start and where does it stop? Somehow we're just keep on keeping on. But yeah, I do recommend the Lakota Law Project. There was a huge case where it was nothing less than human trafficking of organized removal of children for pay, because the state that it was happening in got funded for every child that was removed and put into foster care. It was a money racket, which is human trafficking.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And sorry for my background. I've been painting. Here's my project from our training.
Oh, I like it. Very nice. Is that airbrushing? That looks good.
No, I painted it like by hand.
Oh, nice. Love it.
I'm not an artist, but it's my attempt.
Well, your wainscoting looks pretty dope too, I have to say. I like the two-tone.
Oh, my side, it's actually an ombre. So it goes from like,
Yeah,
all the way down to like dark.
I like it.
Thank you.
So does anyone else have any children or youth specific comments or storytelling, maintaining confidentiality that can just, we're here to educate each other and debrief and release and tell our stories. So if anyone else wants to chime in, that would be really awesome too. Mary, I see your hands up. Go for it.
Yeah, I'm not really sure if this fits the tone of the conversation, but it's something we've been struggling with in our community. We had a situation where, we do a lot of restorative justice. So we often work in communities where folks do not want to go to the police. We're abolitionists and do a lot of restorative, justice work and healing work, where we implement like talking circles and other forms of like alternatives to getting justice and protecting community. And we did have a case where someone came forward, and we do a lot of inclusion of LGBTQ and neurodivergence and disability. So there's often a lot of multiple oppressions at play or multiple power systems at play. And in one of these cases, someone came forward with a consent issue. There was verbal consent, but at some point it turned to nonverbal consent, where the person didn't want to continue and didn't really speak to that, but just kind of, stopped participating, physically stopped participating. And so at first we were helping support that person. And then it came to light that the other person involved was a minor. And so both are young adults, and the one who was a minor was very close to being 18. And so the other person was, in their early 20s, like 23, 24. And so it was really challenging to then suddenly shift from, or not shift, but try to support both young people in a case that was clearly had some consent issues, but nuances that are very challenging for adults, let alone very young people, like nonverbal consent, understanding body language, understanding the nonverbal signs that someone is not consenting, and then also the factor that someone was technically a minor, so that of course impacts consent. And our stance as a community has been minors cannot consent, period. And really trying to address like the Lolita situations and the situations where folks are minors but still being treated as though they can consent. So I just wanted to bring that story up and see if other people had similar stories or similar challenges with how you deal with something like that. Our approach was to try to support both folks as being harmed and implement accountability plans that called for, therapy and other things to learn about nonverbal consent, and also to, of course, protect minors. But it was very challenging, especially in a tone where, nobody wanted to involve the local authorities or the police. And of course, some of our folks being mandated reporters, so just so many challenges. It was like a very gray, weird area. And so we're still learning from that experience, and of course, receive criticism from all sides, because everybody has an opinion about what should or shouldn't have been done. And so I just wanted to see if other folks had experienced anything like that or had suggestions.
Opula Mary, yes. I'm gonna just pause to see if other folks want to chime in. So I find that this is more relevant and prevalent than not in all of our work as advocates. It does not matter to me what your general demographic is in advocacy, whether it's domestic violence, sexual violence, trafficking, homelessness, substance abuse, suicidal ideation, mental health, SARTs. At the end of the day, the reason I was so eager to do this module was because it was about our general intertribal philosophy of 7 generations, that our youth are our future in Indian country, right? It just is. And one of the things that is so important while we're moderating and navigating this world of anti-violence and advocacy and counseling and public policy, all the things, at the end of the day, our youth are learning from us. They're learning from our language, our online adult behaviors, the elders' behaviors online and in community. And Mary, I'm so grateful that you chimed in, because consent is huge and very confusing, because we talk about consent generally, and the whole movement is talking about consent. One thing that we're missing, if we're going to talk about consent, we need to talk about withdrawing consent. That you can say yes and then say no. But what does that mean when you say yes and then say no? You're allowed to withdraw the consent. And it is a gray area we're not addressing enough. So Mary, I'm so snapping my fingers, so grateful, because we should never, ever talk about consent without talking about withdrawing consent. Because just because you said yes half an hour ago does not mean yes right now. And it is confusing because we don't talk about it enough. And if we start breaking it down and empowering boys, girls, them, all ages, that they understand that they can withdraw consent. It draws a line in the sand or in the dirt or a hand game. It just draws a line that it is acceptable and it is supported to withdraw. And with youth, it is tricky, right? With mandated reporting, like you had mentioned, it's a very confusing space because we haven't quite worked that out in mainstream movement yet, but I believe in Indian country. And that goes back to that 3rd slide of storytelling, with the compassion and the bravery and the wisdom that we can lead that conversation with our Indigenous values, that withdrawing consent is allowed. But we can't talk about one without the other, because consenting one time does not mean consenting for the next 8 weeks. Mary, does that make sense?
It does make sense. I think it just really highlights the challenges around, this had multiple challenges because we didn't, discover that the other person involved was a minor until way into the process. We were trying really hard to still kind of keep that tone of supporting the survivor who was bringing the consent issue forward. But then the idea that one person was a minor, of course, changed that. Like, it was like, hey, there's consent issues on both sides here. And it's like, it kind of like early in the conversation in the training, where we talked about how, you can't represent both, right? Like, how do you stay in that role of advocate supporting your survivor? And then something like this comes to the surface where you realize that the survivor has also done harm as well. How do you do that and also make sure that both young people learn appropriately and get the appropriate support and get the appropriate, healing that needs to happen. And I think that's where the native, healing process comes to help. But that doesn't always work when, folks are feeling vulnerable and it was really challenging. It almost caused us to shut down a portion of our program that was doing that work. And I think, you know, we were able to get through that and save it. But you know, it was very challenging, and I've yet to find anyone who's really had a clear answer to that. You know, so like you said, I think it's still being struggled with in the mainstream and hasn't gotten to all communities like yet.
I really appreciate that on so many levels. I hope I can find the right words, because words are like paltry sometimes. They're just so weak. My heart and my spirit says, cycles of violence exist, and harm doers, or the confusion area, the gray area in the middle of it, there could be both and. And that is so indigenous for us to consider the both and through compassion and wisdom and trust and bravery. That the colonized way of thinking is there's bad and good and jail or victim, like these, the two worlds, they're not cut and dry. We have cycles of violence where we can restore our indigeneity, and we can restore harm doers because they were assaulted themselves, if that makes sense. And that goes into the same consent conversation, consent and not consent. Is it really black and white, or red and white, or red and black, whatever? You know, I don't even care. But these conversations are essential because it's not this or that. Sometimes, and I'm going to quote Christine right now, it's both and. And that is a really brave approach to take, because it's not easy. Because we have people in our community that are like, you got to choose. You're either with it or you're not. But it's not, that's advocacy, isn't that? Because we also are restoring our tribal communities. We're undoing generations of intergenerational trauma and cycles of abuse that came from the boarding schools. So it is both and. So when you say it was really hard, oh my goodness, I believe you. Because you're trying to honor your community, right? And the survivor and the harm doer that's probably also a survivor. I don't know, is that right on?
Right on, right on.
I appreciate that, thank you. My husky is acting all shoka. He's just being, yeah, I'm sorry. Any other thoughts or comments about Shunko? Oh, my husky. Anyway, sorry. Any other thoughts over the mental health conversation, or the SART conversation, or the you know, children and youth oriented convo? So we have another comment. Thank you for sharing. Thank you all so much. Thank you. And okay, I feel you on that. I had a survivor who thought her rape, sexual violence was her fault because when she was a child, she was sexually assaulted and then perpetrated against a family member because she didn't know better. Oh my goodness. As an adult, she blamed herself. That's the cycle of abuse, right? Self-blame. How many family members assisted in that self-blame and the re-victimization that it was her fault, right? And then we have when they withdraw consent and request you to shred the documents, do we comply? Well, that's an organizational policy ask. What do y'all think about that one? If someone withdraws consent and they request us to shred all evidence, are we going to comply with that? What do y'all think?
I mean, I'm Ashley here. I'm coming from Wisconsin. For us, if they requested a shred, I would probably allow it, or deletion from our system, just because it's what they're looking for, and the hope is that we aren't putting anything in the documents that are very specific anyway. So I would allow it.
Thank you for that. One of the beautiful things about our work, right? And some of you are OVW funded, some are MIWSAC, HHS, OVC. At the end of the day, the beautiful thing about our work is we try to maintain confidentiality without names. So we could destroy documents should there be a name attached, but without, we could have a date attached. Where if someone wants to search, it's all about, how it is, nonprofits being creative, wearing 12 different hats, being creative in funding and the way we do our advocacy. Safety planning is super creative. Someone says shred the documents. We don't have names attached, so there's no identifier, but they could come back and say on July 19th, I reached out and now I want that thing because now I'm ready to press charges. We have creative options, but I respect that if there is a name attached, we want to honor the survivors. But I think there's a workaround that at a future date, we could assist being creative like that. So those are just my own thoughts as an advocate. It's not right. It's not wrong. It's not more than anyone else's thoughts. It's just my thoughts. And then we have another comment. I'm just happy to see mental health being talked about positively amongst youth. Yes, the Bemidji area schools are offering some classes for parents to come in with their youth to talk a bit about mental health and what it looks like in a way they'll understand. That's brilliant, Sky. At the end of the day, we just want to open corridors of language and trust. Doesn't have to be heavy. It could just be like, this is how I'm going to be here for you. These are the basics, and just teach those avenues without requirements or uncomfortable or like tracking with documents. I'm really happy to hear about schools doing that. Any other comments or thoughts to share? Because you all are each other's best peer-to-peer trainers, man. All right, then. Wopila Tonka, thank you so much. It's 5:47 on the East Coast. I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Practice self-care, take care of your families and yourselves, and we will see you all on Thursday. Thank you.
Hey, Rebecca?
Yeah.
I do have a question. It's very specific to my job though, so I didn't want to keep everybody on. I work at a university now, and we have a department, which is our American Indian Student Center. And one of the reasons I'm attending this training is because the director there has continuously had people disclose sexual assault or domestic violence, and she's not super comfortable with it, talking about the topic, because she's gone through it herself. And I was wondering if you have any just ideas on how I can open myself up as a white person to having the students trust that I'm a safe place to come.
Thank you for that. I think the very first thing that, as a survivor, the very first thing that mattered to me was confidentiality. That is assured and reassured that you are a safe space and it will never be reported or recorded or documented. And then also, I don't know if this is an option, but if it's Indigenous focused, to partner up and have a team where there's an Indigenous person as well for that culturally specific safety net, because it is different when you walk into a boardroom and you're the only Native person. or you walk into a shelter and there's no natives in sight, it actually does matter.
Mm-hmm.
Don't know if that's an option for you, but that confidentiality part of security and safety really does feel like a lot at the time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. So I recently took the white bison mending broken hearts training, and I'm hoping to become a trainer for that. So I was hoping to kind of use it as a way to partner with the center. Because right now I don't have a person, like an Indigenous person that I could partner with. And I think that is important.
So it's really fabulous that you said that, because when I was talking about the roots of the boarding school affecting intergenerational trauma, and like, you know, at the end of the day, White Bison trained me when they came to Carlisle, and they said, you know, boarding schools, when that happened, it took children away from their mommies and their daddies and their aunties and their grandparents. So when they became parents, they didn't have the foundation of parental love, and it created cycles of abuse because of the abuse that happened in boarding schools. So I am a big fan of White Bison and their philosophies and training. So that's pretty great to hear. Ashley, I'm going to put my email in the chat. Maybe you could reach out to me and I can try to find or link you up with the right person in your region or a local tribe that might be willing to support you. If that's cool.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be amazing. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. I'll put it in the chat now. Yeah, I'm happy to visit with you. Let's visit. Any other thoughts or questions? If not, we can just disconnect.
I'm good if that was for me. Thank you.
Yeah, that was just for everyone. I see some familiar names here. That's pretty awesome. I hope you all enjoyed your day. And yeah, I'll give another 2 minutes for folks to chime in. Wopila Tonka, Mitakia say thank you so much, all my relations. Y'all have a great evening, and we'll see you on Thursday.